Certain problems of the Marxist-Leninist theory of dialectics. 7. A contribution to the problem of a dialectical materialistic critique of objective idealism. In order to overcome the weaknesses, or rather defects, of any philosophical system, it is necessary to understand them. Marx demonstrated this sort of understanding in relation to Hegel, and thereby went much further in matters of logic than either Hegel or his materialist antipode Feuerbach. Marx, Engels, and Lenin showed both the historical contribution of Hegel and the historically conditioned limitations of his scientific advances, the clearly drawn boundary across which the Hegelian dialectic could not step, and the illusions whose power it was incapable of overcoming despite all the strength of its creator's mind. Hegel's greatness, like his limitations, was due on the whole to his having exhausted the possibilities of developing dialectics on the basis of idealism, within the limits of the premises that idealism imposed on scientific thinking. Irrespective of his intentions, Hegel showed, with exceptional clarity, that idealism led thinking up a blind alley and doomed even dialectically enlightened thought to hopeless circling within itself, to an endless procedure of self-expression and self-consciousness. For Hegel, being, i.e. the world of nature and history existing outside thought and independently of it, was inevitably transformed into a mere pretext for demonstrating the logical art, into an inexhaustible reservoir of examples confirming over and over again the same schemas and categories of logic. As the young Marx remarked, the matter of logic fenced the logic of the matter off from Hegel. And therefore both the Prussian monarch and the louse on the monarch's head could equally well serve the idealist dialectician as examples illustrating the category real individuality in and for itself. With such an approach both the boiling tea kettle and the Great French Revolution were only examples illustrating the relation of the categories of quality and quantity, but any empirical reality impinging on the eye, however fortuitous it might be in itself, was thereby converted into an external embodiment of absolute reason, into one of the necessary dialectical stages of its self-differentiation. The profound flaws in the Hegelian dialectic were directly linked with idealism, due to which the dialectic was readily transformed into ingenious, logically subtle apologies for everything that existed. It is therefore necessary to look into all these circumstances more closely. Hegel actually counterposed man in his real thought to impersonal, featureless, absolute thought as some force existing for ages, in accordance with which the act of divine creation of the world and man had occurred. He also understood logic as absolute form, in relation to which the real world and real human thought proved to be something essentially derivative, secondary and created. In that, too, the idealism of Hegel's conception of thinking was revealed, and it was the specifically Hegelian objective idealism that converted thought into some new god, into some supernatural force existing outside man and dominating him. This specifically Hegelian illusion, however, did not at all express an idea simply taken uncritically by Hegel from religion, or a simple atavism of religious consciousness, as Feuerbach suggested, but a much more profound and serious circumstance. The fact is that the Hegelian conception of thought represented an uncritical description of the real position of things formed on the soil of a narrowly professional form of the division of social labor, that is to say, on the division of mental work from physical labor. From immediately practical, sensuously objective activity. One contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, MECW Vol 3, page 91. Problems of dialectics. 75. Under the spontaneously developing division of social labor there arose of necessity a peculiar inversion of the real relations between human individuals and their collective forces and collectively developed faculties, i.e. the universal means of the activity. An inversion known in philosophy as estrangement or alienation. Here, in social reality, and not at all simply in the fantasies of religiously minded people and idealist philosophers, universal modes of action were organized as special social institutions, established in the form of trades and professions, and of a kind of caste with its own special rituals, language, traditions, and other immanent structures of a quite impersonal and featureless character. As a result, the separate human individual did not prove to be the bearer, i.e. to be the subject, of this or that universal faculty, but, on the contrary, this active power, which was becoming more and more estranged from him, appeared as the subject, dictating the means and forms of his occupation to each individual from outside. The individual as such was thus transformed into a kind of slave, into a speaking tool of alienated universally human forces and faculties, means of activity personified as money and capital, and further as the state, law, religion, and so on. The same fate also befell thought. It, too, became a special occupation, the lot for life of professional scholars, of professionals in mental, theoretical work. Science is thought transformed in certain conditions into a special profession. Given universal alienation, thought achieved the heights and levels of development needed for society as a whole only in the sphere of science, and in that form was really opposed to the majority of human beings, and not simply opposed to them but also dictating to them what they must do from the standpoint of science, and how they must do it, and what and how they must think, etc. Etc. The scientist, the professional theoretician, lays down the law to them not in his own name, personally, but in the name of science, in the name of the concept, in the name of an absolutely universal, collective, impersonal power, appearing before other people as its trusted representative and plenipotentiary. On that soil, too, there arose all the specific illusions of the professionals of mental, theoretical work, illusions that acquired their most conscious expression precisely in the philosophy of objective idealism, i.e. of the self, consciousness of alienated thought. It will readily be noted that Hegel, in his logic, quite exactly expressed, in scholastically disguised form, the fundamental features of human life activity, man's faculty to look at himself from outside as it were, as something other, as a special object. Or in other words to transform the schemas of his own activity into its own object. Period. Since Hegel looked upon this feature of human life activity exclusively through the eyes of logic, he registered it solely to the extent that it was already transformed into a scheme of thought, into a logical schema, into a rule in accordance with which man more or less consciously built this or that specific activity. He therefore registered things, and the position of things located outside the individual's consciousness and beyond his will, exclusively as moments, as metamorphoses of thought, realized and realizable in natural, physical material, including in that also the organic body of man himself. The special feature of human life activity described above in Marx's words also appeared in the Hegelian representation as a scheme of thought realized by man, as a logical figure. The real picture of human life activity obtained here is a topsy-turvy, upside-down representation. In reality man thinks because that is his real life activity. Hegel said the contrary, that real human life. 2. Estranged labor, MECW Vol 3, page 276. Problems of dialectics. 76. Activity was such because man thought in accordance with a definite schema. All determinations of human life activity, naturally, and through it the position of things outside man's head, were only fixed here insofar as they were posited by thought, and appeared as the result of thought. This is only natural because the logician who specially studied thought was no longer interested in things as such, as a reality existing before, outside of, and independently of man and his act, but in things as, and as what, they appeared as a result of the activity of a thinking being, of the subject. as the product of thought understood as an activity, the specific product of which was the concept. So Hegel was guilty of remaining a pure logician just there where the standpoint of logic was inadequate. This peculiar professional blindness of the logician showed up primarily in the fact that he looked upon practice, i.e. the real, sensuously objective activity of man, solely as a criterion of truth, solely as the verifying authority for thought, for the mental, theoretical work completed before and independently of practice, or rather for the results of that work. Practice there was thus also understood abstractly, was only illuminated from that aspect, and in those characteristics, which it owed in fact to thought, because it was the act of realizing a certain intention, plan, idea, concept, or some aim selected in advance. Was absolutely not analyzed as such in a determination of its own, not dependent on some thought. All the results of people's practical activity, things made by human labor, and historical events and their consequences, were correspondingly only taken into account insofar as they embodied or objectified some idea or another. In a conception of the historical process as a whole, such a point of view was understandably the purest idealism. As regards logic, however, the science of thought, it was not only justified but was the sole rational position. In fact, can we reproach the logician for abstracting everything in the most rigorous fashion that had nothing to do with the subject matter of his investigation, and for paying attention to any fact only insofar as it could be understood as the consequence, as the form of disclosure of his subject matter, of the subject matter of his science, i.e. of thought? To reproach the professional logician for the fact that the matter of logic concerned him more than the logic of the matter, would be as stupid as to reproach the chemist for excessive attention to the matter of chemistry. But Marx's words above, directed at Hegel, concealed quite another meaning. The fault of the narrow professional was not at all his rigorous limitation of thought to the framework of the subject matter of his science, but his incapacity to see clearly the boundaries of the competence of his science associated with this limitation of his view of things. The same applied to Hegel, the typical professional logician. As a logician he was right to look upon a statement or a fact exclusively from the standpoint of the abstract schemas of thought revealed in it, when the logic of any matter interested him only insofar as it was revealed in it in general. The mysticism of Hegel's logic, and at the same time its insidious feature, which Marx called his false positivism, began where the special standpoint of the logician ex professo was adopted and distinguished from the sole scientific standpoint from the heights of which only the ultimate, most profound, most cherished, and most important truth accessible in general to man and to humanity was allegedly discovered. As a logician Hegel was quite right in looking on any phenomenon in the development of human culture as an act disclosing the power of thought. But it was the work of a moment, by adding a little something to that view, namely that the essence of the phenomena in themselves from which the special, logical abstractions were drawn was expressed just in those abstractions. 3. Critique of Hegel's philosophy in general MECW Vol 3, page 339. Problems of dialectics. 77. For the truth to be transformed into a lie, the exact results of a chemical investigation of the composition of the colors used to paint the Sistine Madonna would be converted into such a lie the moment the chemist looked on them as the sole scientific explanation of the unique synthesis, created by Raphael's brush. Abstractions that quite precisely expressed the forms and schemas of the flow of thought in all forms of its concrete realization were immediately and directly passed off as schemas of the process that had created the whole diversity of human culture, in which they were discovered. As a result, the whole mystique of Hegel's conception of thought was concentrated in a single point. In considering all the manifold forms of human culture as a result of manifestation of the faculty to think that functions in man, he lost any chance of understanding from where in general this unique faculty, and its schemas and rules, appeared in man. By raising thought to the rank of a divine power and force impelling man to historical creation from within, Hegel simply passed off the absence of a reply to this reasonable question as the only possible answer to it. The sensuously objective activity of the millions of people who by their labor created the body of culture, the self-consciousness of which is scientific thought, remained outside Hegel's field of view, seemed to him the prehistory of thought. The external world therefore appeared as the initial material for producing the concept, as something that had to be processed by means of existing concepts in order to concretize them. Thought was thus transformed into the only active and creative force, and the external world into its field of application. Naturally, if the sensuously objective activity of social man was represented as the consequence, as the external objectification of ideas, plans, and concepts created by thought, it became in principle impossible to say either what was the source of thought in the head of theoreticians or how it arose. Thought was, Hegel replied, and to ask about its origin from something else was to ask a futile question. It operated in man, and gradually arrived at awareness of its own activities, and of their schemas and laws. Logic was self-consciousness of this creative principle, of this infinite creative power, of this absolute form, which had never arisen from anywhere. In man this creative force was only revealed, objectified, and estranged so as then in logic to cognize itself as such, as the universal creative force. That was the whole secret of Hegel's objective idealism. In logic, consequently, objective idealism means the absence of any answer whatsoever to the question from whence thought originates. In the form of logic, defined as a system of eternal and absolute schemas of every kind of creative activity, Hegel deified real human thought and its logical forms and patterns. That was at once the strength and the weakness of his conception of thought and logic. Its strength was that he idolized the nevertheless real logical forms and laws of human thought discovered by him through study of human spiritual and material culture. Its weakness was that, for all that, he idolized the logical forms and laws of human thought, i.e. declared them absolute, without even allowing the problem of their origin to be posed. The fact was that idealism, i.e. the view of thought as a universal faculty that was only aroused to self consciousness in man and did not arise in the exact and strict sense from the soil of definite conditions formed outside him and independently of him, led to a number of absolutely unresolvable problems in logic itself. While making an exceptionally important advance in understanding of the logical forms of thought, Hegel stopped halfway, and even turned back. As soon as he was faced with the question of the interrelation of sensuously perceived forms of the embodiment of the mind's activity, in which the mind became the object of consideration for itself. Thus he refused to recognize the word as the sole form of the effective being of the spirit, of the external disclosure of the problems of dialectics. 78. Creative power of thought. Nevertheless, he continued to consider it the principal, most adequate form, the form in which thought was counterposed to itself. In the beginning was the word. In respect of human thought, Hegel maintained the biblical position unsullied, accepting it as something self-evident and making it the basic principle of all subsequent construction, or rather reconstruction, of the development of the thinking spirit to self-consciousness. The thinking mind of man was first aroused precisely in the word and through the word, as the faculty of naming, and therefore took shape primarily as the kingdom of names and titles. The word also functioned as the first objective reality of thought activity, both in essence and in time, as the initial and immediate form of being of the spirit for itself. This appeared clearly as follows: one finite spirit made itself the subject matter of another, also finite, spirit in the word and through the word. Having arisen from the mind as a definitely articulated sound, on being heard the word was again converted into spirit, into the state of the thinking mind of another person. The vibrations of the ambient air also proved to be only the pure mediator between the two states of the spirit, the mode of the relation of spirit to spirit, or, expressing it in Hegelian language, of the spirit to itself. The word functioned here as the first tool of the external objectification of thought, which the thinking spirit created from itself in order to become the object for itself. The real tool, the stone axe or cutting tool, scraper or wooden plow, began to appear as the second and secondary, derived tool of the same process of objectification as the sensuously objective metamorphosis of thought. Thus Hegel saw in the word the form of the actual being of the thinking spirit in which the latter manifested its own creative force before everything, before and independently of the real molding of nature by labor. Labor only realized what the thinking spirit had found in itself in the course of futterance, in the course of its dialogue with itself. But in this interpretation the dialogue proved to be only a monologue of the thinking spirit, only its mode of manifestation. In the phenomenology of mind all history therefore began with an analysis of the contradiction that arose between thought and all its other content not yet expressed in words. The science of logic also suggested the schema, and contained the same, though implicit premise at its very beginning. Thought, it was suggested there, had realized and was realizing itself primarily in and through the word. So it was no accident that the consummation of all the phenomenological and logical history of the thinking spirit consisted in returning to the starting point. The thinking spirit achieved its absolutely exact and perfect representation. Naturally in the printed word, in a treatise on logic, in the science of logic, Hegel therefore also maintained the following in logic: it is in human language that the forms of thought are manifested and laid down in the first instance. In our day it cannot be too often recalled, that what distinguishes man from the beast is the faculty of thought. Language has penetrated into whatever becomes for man something inner, becomes, that is, an idea, something which he makes his very own, and what man transforms to language contains concealed, or mixed up with other things. Or worked out to clearness, a category that was the deepest root of Hegel's idealism. By that step thought as an activity taking place in the head in the form, precisely, of inner speech, was converted into the starting point for understanding all the phenomena of culture, both spiritual and material, including all historical events, social, economic, and political structures, and so on and so forth, the whole world of the products of human labor and. For Hegel's Science of Logic, translated by A.V. Miller, Preface, page 31. Problems of Dialectics. 79. All history, then began to be interpreted as a process taking place from the power of thought. The whole grandiose conception of the history of the estrangement of the creative energy of thought and its inverse mastering of the fruits of its labor, which began with the word and completed its cycle in the word, was just the history outlined in the Science of Logic. The clue to Hegel's conception is not so very complicated. The idea that man thought initially, and then only really acted served as the foundation of his schema. Hence also the schema word, act, thing made by the act, again word. And further, there was a new cycle according to the same schema, but on a new basis, owing to which the movement had the form not of a circle but of a spiral, each turn of which, however, both began and ended at one and the same point, in a word. The rational kernel and at the same time the mystifying feature of the schema described here are most easily considered by analogy with the metamorphoses that political economy brings out when analyzing commodity money circulation. Just as accumulated labor concentrated in machines, in the instruments and products of labor, functions in the form of capital, in the form of self-expanding value, for which the individual capitalist functions as executor, so too scientific knowledge, i.e. the accumulated mental labor of society, functions in the form of science, i.e. the same sort of impersonal and featureless anonymous force. The individual professional theoretician functions as the representative of the self-developing power of knowledge. His social function boils down to being the individual embodiment of the universal spiritual wealth accumulated over centuries and millennia of mental labor. He functions as the animated tool of a process that is completed independently of his individual consciousness and his individual will, the process of the increase of knowledge. He does not think here as such. Knowledge, which has taken root in his head during his education, thinks. He does not control the concept, rather the concept controls him, determining both the direction of his research and the modes and forms of his activity. There is the same turning upside down as in the sphere of material production based on exchange value. The same real mystification of the relations between the universal and the particular, in which the abstract universal is not an aspect or property of the sensuously concrete but rather the contrary, the sensuous concrete. Individual man proves to be only an abstract, one-sided embodiment of the universal. This is not simply an analogy with what happens in the world of relations founded on value, but the same social process, only in the sphere of mental rather than material production. This inversion, by which the sensibly concrete is regarded as a form of manifestation of the abstract and general, instead of the abstract and general being regarded on the contrary as a property of the concrete, is characteristic of the expression of value. At the same time, it makes the expression of value difficult to understand. If I say, Roman law and German law are both law, that is self-evident. If, on the other hand, I say, the law, which is an abstraction, is realized as such in Roman law and in German law, which are concrete laws, the connection between the abstract and the concrete becomes mystical. So Hegel's idealism was not in the least the fruit of religious fantasy or of a religiously oriented imagination. It was only an uncritical description of the real state of things, on the soil of which the professional theoretician, the narrow specialist of mental labor, operated. The forms of his philosophy were the practically inevitable illusions that he inevitably created in his own work, illusions that were fed by the objective position of that work in society, and reflected its position. It was the knowledge acquired by him as concepts immediately in the course of his education, i.e. in the form of verbal sign expressions, which was for him the beginning of his specific activity, and the end, its specific goal, its real entelechy. 5. The value form, appendix to Capital, published in Capital N Class, number 4 1978. Problems of Dialectics. 80. But the analogy we have used enables us also to understand another circumstance, i.e. the mechanism itself of the inversion or turning upside down described above. The pattern of commodity money circulation is, as we know, expressed by the formula CMC. The commodity appears in it as both the beginning and the end of the cycle, and money as its mediating link, as the metamorphosis of the commodity. But at a certain point in the self-closing cyclical movement CMCM, and so on, money ceases to be a simple intermediary, the means of circulation of the mass of commodities, and suddenly discloses an enigmatic faculty for self-expansion. Schematically, this phenomenon is expressed in the formula as follows, MCM. The commodity, the real starting point of the process as a whole, acquires the former role of money, the role of intermediary and means of the transient metamorphosis of money, in which the latter is embodied in order to complete the act of self-expansion. Money, having acquired so mysterious a property, is also capital, and in the form of the latter acquires the occult quality of being able to add value to itself and suddenly presents itself as substance endowed with an independent motion of its own. A substance of which commodities and money are themselves merely forms. In the formula MCM, value appears as an automatically operating subject, as the substance subject of the whole cyclic movement, constantly returning to its starting point. Value is here the active factor in a process in which While continually assuming by turns the form of money and the form of commodities, it at the same time changes in magnitude, gives birth to surplus value, so that the original value spontaneously expands, and this happens in itself. In his Science of Logic, Hegel recorded the same situation, only not in regard to value but to knowledge. In fact, he dealt with the process of accumulation of knowledge, because the concept is also accumulated knowledge, the constant capital, so to say, of thought, which always appears in science in the form of the word. Hence, too, the idea of knowledge, analogous to the idea of value, as a self-expanding substance, as a subject substance. Thus we are dealing not with the abstract fantasies of an idealist but with the same uncritical description of the real process of the production and accumulation of knowledge as the theory of political economy, which takes as the starting point of its explanation an exactly recorded but not understood fact. The fact is that money, appearing as the form of movement of capital, as the starting point and goal of the whole cyclical process of coming back to itself, discloses a mysterious, occult faculty for self-expansion and self-development. This fact, left unexplained, becomes mysterious and occult, and a property is ascribed to it that in fact belongs to quite another process that is expressed in its form. In disclosing the secret of the self-expansion of value, i.e. the secret of the production and accumulation of surplus value, in capital Marx employed the whole terminology of Hegelian logic given above, and of Hegel's conception of thought. The fact is that the idealist illusion created by Hegel the logician had the same nature as the practically necessary illusions that entrap the mind of man caught up in the process of the creation and accumulation of surplus value, which is not understood by him and takes place independently of his consciousness and will. The logical and socio-historical patterns of the origin of these illusions were objectively and subjectively the same. For the capitalist, a certain sum of money is the starting point of all his further activity as a capitalist, and therefore the formal goal of his special activity. From where the sum of money arose, originally, with its occult properties, and may have no special interest for him. 6 Capital, MECW Vol 35, page 164, 7 Ibid, page 159, 8 Ibid, page 164. Problems of dialectics. 81. Something analogous also happens with the professional theoretician, with the person who represents personified knowledge, science, the concept. For him, the knowledge accumulated by humanity, and recorded moreover in verbal, sign form, also appears simultaneously as the starting point and as the goal of his special work. From his point of view, naturally, the concept makes itself out to be a self-developing substance, an automatically operating subject, the subject substance of all its changes, and of all its metamorphoses. Hence, from the real form of the life activity of the professional theoretician there also grow all the practically necessary illusions about thought and concept that were systematically expressed in Hegel's Science of Logic. The Hegelian logic described the system of the objective forms of thought within the limits of which revolved the process of extended reproduction of the concept, which never began, in its developed forms, from the very beginning, but took place as the perfecting of already existing concepts, as the transformation of already accumulated theoretical knowledge, as its increment. The concept was always already presupposed here in the form of a jumping-off point for new conquests, since it was a matter of extending the sphere of the cognized, and in that the initial concepts played a most active role. If the separate forms of the manifestation that expanding, growing knowledge drew by turns into its living circulation were recorded, the following definitions would be obtained. Science is words. Science is the things created on the basis of knowledge, i.e. the objectified, materialized force of knowledge. Knowledge becomes the subject of a certain process in which, here, while constantly changing its verbal form into an objective material one, it alters its magnitude and its scale, throws off as surplus knowledge from itself as the initial knowledge, and self-develops. For the movement in which knowledge unites new knowledge to itself is its own movement, and its expansion is consequently self-expansion, self-intensification, self-development. It has acquired the occult faculty of creating knowledge by virtue of the fact that it is itself knowledge. By analogy with the production and accumulation of surplus value, logical forms began therefore to appear here as forms of the self-development of knowledge, and so were mystified. The mystification consisted in the pattern or scheme that expressed the features of the activity of the professional theoretician, being accepted and passed off as the pattern of development of knowledge in general. So, we see, it was the same mystification as in political economy, in analyzing which Marx stressed that his investigation did not begin with an analysis of value, but with analysis of a commodity. From the logical standpoint that is most important in principle, because it was the analysis of a commodity that bared the secret of the birth and origin of value, and then also the secret of its manifestation in money form. In the contrary case, the secret of the birth of value was unresolvable in principle. The same thing took place with the concept of thought in the Hegelian scheme. Hegel recorded those features that were actually realized in the process of thought in its developed form, in the form of science, as a special sphere of the division of social labor. And the formula that there quite accurately reflected the surface of the process appeared as follows: word, act, word, in which by word is understood verbally recorded knowledge, knowledge in its universal form, in the form of the language of science, in the form of formulae, diagrams, symbols, models of all kinds, blueprints, etc., etc. A really critical mastering of Hegel's logic, carefully preserving all its positive features and purging it of mystic worship of pure thought in the divine concept, proved only to be within the power of Marx and Engels. No other philosophical system since Hegel has been able to handle it as a tool of criticism, since not one of them has adopted the standpoint of a revolutionary, critical attitude to the objective conditions that feed the illusions of idealism, i.e. to the situation of the estrangement of the real, active faculties of man from the majority of individuals, the situation in which all the problems of dialectics. 82. Universal forces, i.e. the active faculties of social man, appear as forces independent of the majority of individuals and dominating them as external necessity, as forces monopolized by more or less narrow groups, strata, and classes of society. The sole path to a real, critical mastering of Hegel's conception of thought lay through a revolutionary, critical attitude to the world of alienation, i.e. to the world of commodity-capitalist relations. Only along that path could the objective idealist illusions of Hegel's conception be really explained, and not simply attacked by such biting epithets as mystical nonsense, theological atavism, and others of that kind. 8. The materialist conception of thought as the subject matter of logic. After what Hegel had done, it was only possible to advance in a single direction, along the road to materialism, to a clear understanding of the fact that all dialectical schemas and categories revealed in thought by Hegel were universal forms and laws, reflected in the collective consciousness of man, of the development of the external real world existing outside of and independently of thought. Marx and Engels had already begun a materialist rethinking of the Hegelian dialectic at the beginning of the 1840s, and the materialistically rethought dialectic fulfilled the role, for them, of the logic of the development of the materialist world outlook. This movement was seen as a direct continuation of Feuerbach's argumentation, and when it was expressed in the terms of his philosophy it appeared approximately as follows: the ego did not think, nor reason, nor even the brain. Man thought by means of his brain and, moreover in unity and contact with nature. Abstracted from that unity he no longer thought. That was where Feuerbach left it. But, continued Marx, man, too, did not think in immediate unity with nature. Man only thought when he was in unity with society, with the social and historical collective that produced his material and spiritual life. Abstracted from the nexus of the social relations within and through which he effected his human contact with nature, he thought as little as a brain isolated from the human body. Thus it was along the path of development of logic that the problem of the nature of human thought, the problem of the ideal, reached its full stature. The ideal is the subjective image of objective reality, i.e. reflection of the external world in the forms of man's activity, in the forms of his consciousness and will. The ideal is not an individual, psychological fact, much less a physiological fact, but a socio-historical one, the product and form of mental production. It exists in a variety of forms of men's social consciousness and will as the subject of the social production of material and spiritual life. In Marx's description, the ideal is nothing other than the material when it has been transposed and translated inside the human head. All the diverse forms of resolving the problem of the ideal in the history of philosophy are attracted to two poles, the materialist and the idealist. Pre-Marxian materialism, while justly rejecting spiritualist and dualist ideas of the ideal as a special substance counterposed to the material world, considered the ideal as an image, as the reflection of a material body in another material body, i.e. as an attribute, a function of specially organized matter. This general materialist conception of the nature of the ideal, which constituted the essence of the line of Democritus Spinoza Diderot Feuerbach, irrespective of variance of its concretization by individual materialists, also served as the starting point for the Marxist-Leninist solution of the problem. The weak sides of the pre-Marxian materialism, which appeared as a trend among French materialists and later in Feuerbach, and acquired independent form in the middle of the 19th century as so-called vulgar materialism, were linked with an unhistorical, anthropological, naturalistic conception of the nature of man. 9 Capital, afterward, MECW Vol 35, page 19. Problems of dialectics. 83. And led to a rapprochement and ultimately to direct identification of the ideal with the material, neurophysiological structures of the brain and their functions. The old materialism set out from a conception of man as part of nature but, not bringing materialism as far as history, it could not understand man in all his peculiarities as a product of labor transforming both the external world and man himself. By virtue of that the ideal could not be understood as the result and active function of labor, of the sensuously objective activity of social man. As the image of the external world arising in the thinking body not in the form of the result of passive contemplation but as the product and form of active transformation of nature by the labor of generations succeeding one another in the course of historical development. The main transformation that Marx and Engels effected in the materialist conception of the nature of the ideal therefore related primarily to the active aspect of the relation of thinking man to nature, i.e. the aspect that had been mainly developed, as Lenin put it, by clever idealism, by the line of Plato Fichte Hegel, and was emphasized by them in an abstract, one-sided, idealist way. The main fact on which the classic systems of objective idealism had grown up was the independence of the aggregate social culture and its forms of organization from the individual. And more broadly the conversion in general of the universal products of social production into a special social force opposed to individuals and dominating their wills and minds. It was for that reason that the social power, i.e. the multiplied productive force, which arises through the cooperation of different individuals as it is determined within the division of labor, appears to these individuals, since their cooperation is not voluntary but natural. Not as their own united power but as an alien force existing outside them, of the origin and end of which they are ignorant, which they thus cannot control, which on the contrary passes through a peculiar series of phases and stages independent of the will and the action of man. Nay, even being the prime governor of these, the power of the social whole over individuals was directly disclosed and functioned in the form of the state and the political system of society, in the form of a system of moral, ethical, and legal limitations and norms of social behavior, and further, of aesthetic, logical and other standards and criteria. The individual was forced from childhood to reckon much more seriously with the requirements and limitations expressed and socially sanctioned in them than with the immediately perceived external appearance of single things and situations, or the organically inherent desires, inclinations, and needs of his own body. The social whole was also mystified in the fundamental principles of objective idealism. Exposing the earthly basis of idealist illusions, Marx and Engels wrote, this sum of productive forces, forms of capital and social forms of intercourse, which every individual and generation finds in existence as something given, is the real basis of what the philosophers have conceived as substance and essence of man, and what they have identified and attacked. All general images, however, without exception, neither sprang from universal schemas of the work of thought nor arose from an act of passive contemplation of nature unsullied by man, but took shape in the course of its practical, objective transformation by man, by society. They arose and functioned as forms of the social man determination of the purposive will of the individual, i.e. as forms of real activity. General images, moreover, were crystallized in the body of spiritual culture quite unintentionally, and independently of the will and consciousness of individuals, although through their activities. In intuition they appeared precisely as the forms of things created by human activity, or as stamps laid on natural, physical material by men's activities, as forms of purposive will alienated in external substance. People were only concerned with nature as such to the extent that it was involved in one way or another in the process of social labor, was transformed into material, into a means, a condition of active human practice. Even the starry heavens, in which human labor still could not really alter. 10 German Ideology MECW Vol 5, page 47, 11 Ibid, page 54. Problems of dialectics. 84. Anything became the object of man's attention and contemplation when they were transformed by society into a means of orientation in time and space, into a tool of the life activity of the organism of social man, into an organ of his body, into his natural clock, compass, and calendar. The universal forms and patterns of natural material really showed through and were realized just to the extent to which this material had already been transformed into building material of the inorganic body of man, of the objective body of civilization, and so the universal forms of things in themselves appeared to man immediately as active forms of the functioning of his inorganic body. The ideal existed immediately only as the form of the activity of social man, directed to the external world. When, therefore, we spoke of the material system, of which the ideal was the function and mode of existence, that system was only social man in unity with the objective world through which he exercised his specifically human life activity. The ideal thus did not boil down to the state of matter found in the cranium of the individual, i.e. the brain. It was the special function of man as the subject of social labor activity, accomplished in forms created by preceding development. Between contemplating and thinking man and nature in itself there existed a very important mediating link through which nature was transformed into thought, and thought into the body of nature. That was practice, labor, production. It was production that transformed the object of nature into the object of contemplation and thought. Even the objects of the simplest sensuous certainty are only given to him through social development, industry and commercial intercourse. Therefore, Marx said, Feuerbach also stopped at the standpoint of contemplation of nature and never manages to conceive the sensuous world as the total living sensuous activity of the individuals composing it. Did not see that the object of his contemplation was the product of joint human labor. And in order to single out the image of nature in itself, it was necessary to expend rather more labor and effort than the simple efforts of disinterested, aesthetically developed contemplation. In immediate contemplation, the objective features of nature in itself were bound up with the features and forms that had been stamped on it by the transforming activity of man, and all the purely objective characteristics of natural material, moreover, were given to contemplation through the image that the natural material had acquired in the course of, and as a result of, the subjective activities of social man. Contemplation was immediately concerned not with the object but with objective activity, transforming it, and with the results of this subjective activity. A purely objective picture of nature was therefore disclosed to man not in contemplation but only through activity and in the activity of man socially producing his own life, of society. Thought, setting itself the aim of depicting the image of nature in itself, had to take that circumstance fully into account, because only the same activity has transformed the true image of nature. Could indicate what it was like before and without subjective distortions. Only practice, consequently, was capable of resolving which features of the object given in contemplation belonged to the object of nature itself, and which had been introduced into it by man's transforming activity, i.e. by the subject. Therefore the question whether objective truth is an attribute of human thought, is not a theoretical but a practical question. Man must prove the truth, i.e. the reality and power, the decidedness of his thinking in practice, Marx wrote in his second thesis on Feuerbach. The dispute over the reality or non-reality of thinking that is isolated from practice is a purely scholastic question. 12 German Ideology MECW Vol 5, page 39, 13 Ibid, page 40-41 14 Theses on Feuerbach, section 2 Opposite, page 6. Problems of Dialectics. 85. That, too, constitutes the solution of many of the difficulties that have faced and still face philosophers. In analyzing the relation of production to consumption, i.e. a problem of political economy, and hence not a psychological one, Marx formulated the question as follows: if it is clear that production offers consumption its external object, it is therefore equally clear that consumption ideally posits the object of production as an internal image, as a need, as a drive and as purpose. But consumption, as Marx showed, is only an inner moment of production, or production itself, since it creates not only the external object but also the subject capable of producing and reproducing this object, and then of consuming it in the appropriate manner. In other words, production creates the form itself of man's active practice, or the faculty of creating an object of certain form and using it for its purpose, i.e. in its role and function in the social organism. In the form of an active, real faculty of man as the agent of social production, the object exists ideally as a product of production, i.e. as an inner image, requirement, and an urge and goal of human activity. The ideal is therefore nothing else than the form of things, but existing outside things, namely in man, in the form of his active practice, i.e. it is the socially determined form of the human being's activity. In nature itself, including the nature of man as a biological creature, the ideal does not exist. As regards the natural, material organization of the human body, it has the same external character as it does in regard to the material in which it is realized and objectified in the form of a sensuously perceived thing. Thus the form of a jar growing under the hands of a potter does not form part either of the piece of clay or of the inborn, anatomical, physiological organization of the body of the individual functioning as potter. Only insofar as man trains and exercises the organs of his body on objects created by man for man does he become the bearer of the active forms of social man's activity that create the corresponding objects. It is clear that the ideal, i.e. the active form of social man's activity, is immediately embodied, or as it is now fashionable to say, is coded, in the form of the neurocerebral structures of the cortex of the brain, i.e. quite materially. But the material being of the ideal is not itself ideal but only the form of its expression in the organic body of the individual. In itself the ideal is the socially determined form of man's life activity corresponding to the form of its object and product. To try and explain the ideal from the anatomical and physiological properties of the body of the brain is the same unfruitful whim as to try and explain the money form of the product of labor by the physico-chemical features of gold. Materialism in this case does not consist at all in identifying the ideal with the material processes taking place in the head. Materialism is expressed here in understanding that the ideal, as a socially determined form of the activity of man creating an object in one form or another, is engendered and exists not in the head but with the help of the head in the real objective activity of man as the active agent of social production. Scientific determinations of the ideal are therefore obtained by way of a materialist analysis of the anatomy and physiology of the social production of the material and spiritual life of society. And in no case of the anatomy and physiology of the brain as an organ of the individual's body. It is the world of the products of human labor in the constantly renewed act of its reproduction that is, as Marx said, the perceptibly existing human psychology, and any psychology to which this open book of human psychology remains unknown, cannot be a real science. When Marx defined the ideal as the material transposed and translated inside the human head, he did not understand this head naturalistically, in terms of natural science. He had in mind the socially developed head of man, all of whose forms of activity, beginning with the forms of language and its word stock and syntactical system and ending with logical categories, are products and forms of social development. Only when expressed in these forms is the external, the material, transformed into social fact, into the property of social man, i.e. into the ideal. 15 Grundriss, MECW Vol 28, page 30. Problems of Dialectics. 86. At first hand, transformation of the material into the ideal consists in the external fact being expressed in language, which is the immediate actuality of thought. But language of itself is as little ideal as the neurophysiological structure of the brain. It is only the form of expression of the ideal, its material objective being. Neopositivists, who identify thought, i.e. the ideal with language, with a system of terms and expressions, therefore make the same naturalistic mistake as scientists who identify the ideal with the structures and functions of brain tissue. Here, too, the form only of its material expression is taken for the ideal. The material is really transplanted into the human head, and not simply into the brain as an organ of the individual's body, only when it is expressed in immediately, generally significant forms of language, understood in the broadest sense of the word, including the language of drawings, diagrams, models, etc., and when it is transformed into an active form of man's activity with a real object. In other words, the object proves to be idealized only when the faculty of actively recreating it has been created, relying on the language of words or drawings, when the faculty of converting words into deeds, and through deeds into things, has been created. Spinoza understood this beautifully. With good reason he linked adequate ideas, expressed in the words of a language, precisely with ability to reproduce given verbal forms in real space. It was just there that he drew the distinction between a determination expressing the essence of the matter, i.e. the ideal image of the object, and nominal, formal definitions that fixed a more or less accidentally chosen property of the object, its outward sign. A circle, for example, could be defined as a figure in which lines drawn from the center to the circumference were equal. But such a definition did not quite express the essence of a circle, but only a certain property of it, which property was derivative and secondary. It was another matter when the definition included the proximate cause of the thing. Then a circle should be defined as a figure described by any line one end of which was fixed and the other moved. This definition provided the mode of constructing the thing in real space. Here the nomical definition arose together with the real action of the thinking body along the spatial contour of the object of the idea. In that case man also possessed an adequate idea, i.e. an ideal image, of the thing, and not just signs expressed in words. That is also a materialist conception of the nature of the ideal. The ideal exists there where there is a capacity to recreate the object in space, relying on the word, on language, in combination with the need for the object, plus material provision of the act of creation. Determination of the ideal is thus especially dialectical. It is that which is not, together with that which does not exist in the form of an external, sensuously perceived thing but at the same time does exist as an active faculty of man. It is being, which is, however, not being, or the effective being of the external thing in the phase of its becoming in the activity of the subject, in the form of its inner image, need, urge, and aim, and therefore the ideal being of the thing is distinguished from its real being. And also from the bodily, material structures of the brain and language by which it exists within the subject. The ideal image of the object is distinguished from the structure of the brain and language in principle by the fact that it is the form of the external object. It is also distinguished from the external matter of nature but in the organic body of man and in the body of language as a subjective image. The ideal is consequently the subjective being of the object, or its otherness, i.e. the being of one object in and through another, as Hegel expressed this situation. The ideal, as the form of social man's activity, exists where the process of the transformation of the body of nature into the object of man's activity, into the object of labor, and then into the product of labor, takes place. The same thing can be expressed in another way, as follows: the form of the external thing involved in the labor process is sublated in the subjective form of objective activity, the latter is objectively registered in the subject in the form of the mechanisms of higher nervous activity, and then there is the reverse sequence of these metamorphoses. Namely, the verbally expressed idea is transformed into a deed, and through the deed into the form of an external, sensuously perceived thing, into a thing. These two contrary series of metamorphoses form a closed cycle. Problems of dialectics. 87. Thing, deed, word, deed, thing. Only in this cyclic movement, constantly renewed, does the ideal image of the thing exist. The ideal is immediately realized in a symbol and through a symbol, i.e. through the external, sensuously perceived, visual or audible body of a word. But this body, while remaining itself, proves at the same time to be the being of another body and as such as its ideal being, its meaning, which is quite distinct from its bodily form immediately perceived by the ears or eyes. As a sign, as a name, a word has nothing in common with what it is the sign of. What is common is only discovered in the act of transforming the word into a deed, and through the deed into a thing, in practice and the mastering of its results. Man exists as man, as the subject of activity directed to the world around and to himself, from such time, and so long, as he actively produces his real life in forms created by himself and by his own labor. And labor, the real transformation of the world around and of himself, which is performed in socially developed and socially sanctioned forms, is just the process, beginning and continuing completely independent of thought, within which the ideal is engendered and functions as its metamorphosis, idealization of reality, nature, and social relations is completed. And the language of symbols is born as the external body of the ideal image of the external world. In that is the secret of the ideal and in that too is its solution. In order to make both the essence of the secret, and the means by which Marx resolved it, clearer, let us analyze the most typical case of the idealization of actuality, or the act of the birth of the ideal, namely the phenomenon of price in political economy. The price, or the money form, of commodities is, like their form of value generally, distinct from their palpable and real bodily form. It is, that is to say, only an ideal or imaginary form. In the first place let us note that price is an objective category and not a psychophysiological phenomenon, yet it is only an ideal form. It is that which constitutes the materialism of the Marxian conception of price. Idealism on the contrary consists in affirming that price, since it is only an ideal form, exists solely as a subjective, psychic phenomenon, the interpretation that was given by none other than Bishop Berkeley, who wrote not only as a philosopher but also as an economist. In making his critique of the idealist conception of money, Marx showed that price was the value of the product of man's labor expressed in money, for example, in a certain quantity of gold. But gold of itself, by its nature, was not money. It proved to be money because it performed a peculiar social function, the measure of value of all commodities, and as such functioned in the system of social relations between people in the process of the production and exchange of products, hence, too, the ideality of the form of price. Gold, while remaining itself in the process of circulation, nevertheless proved to be immediately the form of existence and movement of a certain other, represented and replaced that other in the process of commodity money circulation, and was its metamorphosis. As price, the commodity relates to money on one side as something existing outside itself, and secondly it is ideally posited as money itself, since money has a reality different from it. Alongside real money, there now exists the commodity as ideally posited money. After money is posited as a commodity in reality, the commodity is posited as money in the mind. The ideal positing, or positing of the real product as the ideal image of another product, is accomplished during the circulation of the mass of commodities. It arises as a means of resolving the contradictions maturing in the course of the circulation process, and within it, as a means of satisfying a need that has become imminent in commodity circulation. This need, which appears in the form of an unresolved contradiction of the commodity. 16 Capital, MECW Vol 35, page 105, 17 Grundrisse, MECW Vol 28, page 125, 18 Ibid, page 126. Problems of dialectics. 88. Form is satisfied and resolved by one commodity being expelled from their equal family and being converted into the immediately social standard of the socially necessary expenditure of labor. The problem and the means of solution, as Marx said, arise simultaneously. In real exchange, before the appearance of money, the following position had already taken shape: intercourse in virtue of which the owners of commodities exchange their own articles for various other articles, and compare their own articles with various other articles, never takes place without leading the various owners of the various kinds of articles to exchange these for one special article in which the values of all the others are equated. Such a third commodity, inasmuch as it comes to function as equivalent for various other commodities, acquires, though within narrow limits, a generalized or social equivalent form. Thus the possibility and the necessity also arise of expressing the reciprocal exchange relation of two commodities through the exchange value of a third commodity. Still without the latter entering directly into the real exchange but serving merely as the general measure of the value of the commodities really exchanged. And the third commodity, although it does not enter bodily into the exchange, is all the same involved in the act of exchange, since it is also present only ideally, i.e. in the idea, in the mind of the commodity owners, in speech, on paper, and so on. But it is thus transformed into a symbol and precisely into a symbol of the social relations between people. All theories of money and value that reduce value in its forms to pure symbolics, to the naming of relations, to a conventionally or legally instituted sign, are associated with that circumstance. By the logic of their origin and structure, they are organically related to those philosophers and logicians who, not being able to conceive the active birth of the ideal from the process of social men's objective practical activity, proclaim the forms of expression of the ideal in speech, in terms and statements, to be conventional phenomena, behind which, however, there stands something mystically elusive, be it the experience of neopositivists, the existence of existentialists, or the intuitively grasped, incorporeal, mystical eidetic being of Edmund Husserl. Marx disclosed once and for all the whole triviality of such theories of the ideal, and of its reduction to a symbol or sign of immaterial relations. The fact that commodities are only nominally converted in the form of prices into gold and hence gold is only nominally transformed into money led to the doctrine of the nominal standard of money. Because only imaginary gold or silver, i.e. gold and silver merely as money of account, is used in the determination of prices, it was asserted that the terms pound, shilling, pence, thaler, franc, etc., denote ideal particles of value but not weights of gold or silver or any form of materialized labor. Furthermore, it was already easy to pass to the notion that the prices of commodities were merely terms for relations or propositions, pure signs. Thus objective economic phenomena were transformed into simple symbols behind which there was hidden the will as their substance, representation as the inner experience of the individual ego, interpreted in the spirit of human Berkeley. By exactly the same scheme, modern idealists in logic convert terms and statements into simple names of relations in which the experiences of the solitary individual are posited by the symbolizing activity of language. Logical relations are transformed simply into the names of connections. It must be specially stressed that the ideal transformation of a commodity into gold, and thus of gold into a symbol of social relations, took place both in time and in essence before the real conversion of the commodity into money, i.e. into hard cash. Gold became the measure of the value of commodities before it became the medium of circulation, and so functioned initially as money purely ideally. 19 Capital, MECW Vol 35, page 99, 20 Ibid, page 99, 21 Contribution to Critique of Political Economy, MECW Vol 29, page 314. Problems of Dialectics. 89. Money only circulates commodities which have already been ideally transformed into money, not only in the head of the individual but in the conception held by society. That is a fundamentally important point of the Marxian conception not only of the phenomenon of price but also of the problem of the ideal, the problem of the idealization of reality in general. The fact is that the act of exchange always posits an already formed system of relations between people mediated by things. It is expressed in one of the sensuously perceived things being transformed, without ceasing to function in the system as a separate, sensuously perceived body, into the representative of any other body, into the sensuously perceived body of an ideal image. In other words, it is the external embodiment of another thing, not its sensuously perceived image but rather its essence, i.e. the law of its existence within the system that in general creates the situation being analyzed. The given thing is thus transformed into a symbol the meaning of which remains all the time outside its immediately perceived image, in other sensuously perceived things, and is disclosed only through the whole system of relations of other things to it or, conversely, of it to all the others. But when this thing is really removed from the system it loses its role, i.e. its significance as a symbol, and is transformed once more into an ordinary, sensuously perceived thing along with other such things. Its existence and functioning as a symbol consequently does not belong to it as such but only to the system within which it has acquired its properties. The properties attaching to it from nature therefore have no relation to its existence as a symbol. The corporeal, sensuously perceived envelope or body of the symbol is quite unessential, transient, and temporary for its existence as a symbol. The functional existence of such a thing completely absorbs its material existence, as Marx put it. Furthermore, the material body of the thing is brought into conformity with its function. As a result, the symbol is converted into a token, i.e. into an object that already means nothing in itself but only represents or expresses another object with which it itself has nothing in common. The dialectic of the transformation of a thing into a symbol, and of a symbol into a token, is also traced in Capital on the example of the origin and evolution of the money form of value. The functional existence of a symbol consists precisely in its not representing itself but another, and in being a means, an instrument expressing the essence of other sensuously perceived things, i.e. their universal, socially human significance. Their role and function within the social organism. In other words, the function of a symbol consists in its being just the body of the ideal image of the external thing, or rather the law of its existence, the law of the universal. A symbol removed from the real process of exchange of matter between social man and nature also ceases in general to be a symbol, the corporeal envelope of the ideal image. Its soul vanishes from its body because its soul is in fact the objective activity of social man effecting an exchange of matter between humanized and virgin nature. Without an ideal image man cannot, in general, exchange matter with nature, and the individual cannot operate with things involved in the process of social production. But the ideal image requires real material, including language, for its realization. Therefore labor engenders a need for language, and then language itself. When man operates with symbols or with tokens and not with objects, relying on symbols and tokens, he does not act on the ideal plane but only on the verbal plane. And it very often happens that, instead of discovering the real essence of things by means of terms, the individual sees only the terms themselves with their traditional meanings, sees only the symbol and its sensuously perceived body. In that case the linguistic symbol is transformed from an instrument of real activity into a fetish, blocking off with its body the reality that it represents. Then, instead of understanding and consciously changing. 22 Grundriss, MECW Vol 28, page 123, 23 Capital, MECW Vol 35, page 110. Problems of Dialectics. 90. The external world in accordance with its general laws expressed in the form of the ideal image, man begins to see and change only the verbal, terminological expression and thinks that, in so doing he is changing the world itself. This fetishization of the verbal existence of the ideal was very characteristic of the left Hegelian philosophy of the period of its decline, to which Marx and Engels drew attention at the time. This fetishization of language, and with it fetishization of the system of social relations that it represents, proves to be the absolutely inevitable end of any philosophy that does not understand that the ideal is engendered and reproduced only through social men's objective practical activity, and that it also only exists in that process. In the opposite case, some form or other of fetishization both of the external world and of symbolics develops. It is very curious that no variety of fetishization of the verbal symbolic existence of the ideal embraces the ideal as such. Fetishization registers the results of human activity but not man's activity itself, so that it embraces not the ideal itself but only its estrangement in external objects or in language, i.e. congealed products. That is not surprising. The ideal as a form of human activity exists only in that activity, and not in its results, because the activity is a constant, continuing negation of the existing, sensuously perceived forms of things. Is there change and sublation into new forms? Taking place in accordance with general patterns expressed in ideal forms. When an object has been created, society's need for it is satisfied, the activity has petered out in its product, and the ideal itself has died. An ideal image, say of bread, may arise in the imagination of a hungry man or of a baker. In the head of a satiated man occupied in building a house, ideal bread does not arise. But if we take society as a whole, ideal bread and ideal houses are always in existence, and any ideal object with which man is concerned in the process of production and reproduction of his material life. In consequence of that, all nature is idealized in man and not just that part which he immediately produces or reproduces or consumes in a practical way. Without a constant re-idealizing of the real objects of human life activity, without their transformation into the ideal, and so without symbolization, man cannot in general be the active subject of social production. The ideal also appears as the product and form of human labor, of the purposive transformation of natural material and social relations effected by social man. The ideal is present only where there is an individual performing his activity in forms given to him by the preceding development of humanity. Man is distinguished from beasts by the existence of an ideal plane of activity. But what distinguishes the most incompetent architect and the best of beasts is that the architect has built a cell in his head before he constructs it as wax. The labor process ends in the creation of something which, when the process began, already existed in the worker's imagination, already existed in an ideal form. We must once more note that if the head is understood naturalistically, i.e. as a material organ of the separate individual's body, then there is no difference in principle, it transpires, between the architect and the bee. The wax cell that the bee builds also exists beforehand in the form of the pattern of the insect's activity programmed in its nerve centers. In that sense, the product of the bee's activity is also given ideally before its real performance. But the insect's forms of activity are innate in it, inherited together with the structural, anatomical organization of its body. The form of activity that we can denote as the ideal existence of the product is never differentiated from the body of the animal in any other way than as some real product. The fundamental distinction between man's activity and the activity of an animal is this, that no one form of this activity, no one faculty, is inherited together with the anatomical organization of the body. All forms of activity are passed on only in the form of objects created by man for man. The individual mastery of a humanly determined form of activity, i.e. the ideal image of its object and product, are therefore transformed in a special process that 24 capital MECW Vol 35, page 187-88. Problems of dialectics. 91. Does not coincide with the objective molding of nature. The form itself of man's activity is therefore transformed into a special object, into the object of special activity. When the ideal was defined above as the form of man's activity, that definition was, strictly speaking, incomplete. It characterized the ideal only according to its objectively conditioned content. But the ideal is only there where the form itself of the activity corresponding to the form of the external object is transformed for man into a special object with which he can operate specially without touching and without changing the real object. Up to a certain point, man, and only man, ceases to be merged with the form of his life activity, he separates it from himself and, giving it his attention, transforms it into an idea. Since man is given the external thing in general only insofar as it is involved in the process of his activity, in the final product, in the idea, the image of the thing is always merged with the image of the activity in which this thing functions. That constitutes the epistemological basis of the identification of the thing with the idea, of the real with the ideal, i.e. the epistemological root of any kind or shade of idealism. True, the objectification of the form of activity as a result of which it becomes possible to take it as the form of the thing, and conversely the form of the thing as the product and form of subjective activity, as the ideal is still not, as a matter of fact, idealism. This real fact is only transformed into one variety or another of idealism or fetishism given certain social conditions, or more concretely given the spontaneous division of labor, in which the form of activity is forcibly imposed on the individual by social processes that are independent of him and not understood by him. The objectification of social forms of human activity characteristic of commodity production is quite analogous to the religious alienation of active human faculties and ideas about gods. This analogy is realized quite clearly already within the limits of the objective idealist view of the nature of the ideal. Thus the young Marx, still a left Hegelian, noted that all the ancient gods possessed the same real existence as money did. Did not the ancient Moloch reign? Was not the Delphic Apollo a real power in the life of the Greeks? Kant's critique means nothing in this respect. If somebody imagines that he has $100, if this concept is not for him an arbitrary, subjective one, if he believes in it, then these 100 imagined dollars have for him the same value as 100 real ones. Real dollars have the same existence that the imagined gods have. Has a real dollar any existence except in the imagination, if only in the general or rather common imagination of man? The real nature of this analogy, however, was only disclosed by him later, on the basis of the materialist conception of nature and money and religious images. The similarity of commodity fetishism and religious estrangement is rooted in the real connection of people's social ideas and their real activity, and the forms of practice, in the active role of the ideal image. Up to a certain point man is able to change the form of his activity without touching the thing itself, but only because he can separate the ideal image from himself, objectify it, and operate with it as with an object existing outside him. Let us recall once more the example of the architect, cited by Marx. The architect builds a house not simply in his head but by means of his head, on the plane of ideas on Wadman paper, on the plane of the drawing board. He thus alters his internal state, externalizing it, and operating with it as with an object distinct from himself. In changing it he potentially alters the real house, i.e. changes it ideally, potentially, which means that he alters some sensuously perceived object instead of another. In other words, activity on the plane of representation, altering the ideal image of an object, is also sensuous objective activity transforming the sensuously perceived image of the thing to which it is directed. Only the thing altered here is special, it is only the objectified idea or form of the person's activity taken as a thing. That circumstance also makes it possible to slur over the fundamental, philosophical, epistemological difference between material activity and the activity of the theoretician and ideologist who directly alters only the verbal, token objectification of the ideal image. 25 Doctoral Dissertation MECW Vol 1, page 104. Problems of dialectics. 92. A person cannot pass the ideal as such to another person, as the pure form of activity. One can observe the activity of a painter or an engineer as long as one likes, striving to catch their mode of action, the form of their activity, but one can thus only copy the external techniques and methods of their work but never the ideal image itself, the active faculty itself. The ideal, as the form of subjective activity, is only masterable through active operation with the object and product of this activity, i.e. through the form of its product, through the objective form of the thing, through its active disubjectification. The ideal image of objective reality therefore also only exists as the form of living activity, coordinated with the form of its object, but not as a thing, not as a materially fixed state or structure. The ideal is nothing else than a concatenation of the general forms of human activity realized by individuals, which determine the will and aptitude of individuals to act as an aim in law. It is quite understandable that the individual realization of the ideal image is always linked with some deviation or other, or rather with concretization of the image, with its correcting in accordance with the specific conditions, new social needs, the peculiarities of the material, and so on. And so, it posits the capacity to correlate the ideal image consciously with real, not yet idealized actuality. In that case, the ideal functions as a special object for the individual, an object that he can alter purposively in accordance with the needs of his activity. When, on the contrary, the individual only masters the ideal image formally, as a rigid pattern and sequence of operations, without understanding its origin and links with real actuality, he proves incapable of taking a critical attitude to this image, i.e. as a special object differentiated from him. Then he merges with it, as it were, and cannot treat it as an object correlated with reality and alter it accordingly. In that case, strictly speaking, it is not the individual who operates with the ideal image but the dogmatized image that acts in and through the individual. Here it is not the ideal image that is a real function of the individual but, on the contrary, the individual who is a function of the image, which dominates his mind and will as an externally given formal scheme, as an estranged image, as a fetish. As a system of unarguable rules coming inevitably from somewhere out of the blue, the idealist conception of the nature of the ideal corresponds to just such a consciousness. The materialist conception, on the contrary, will prove to be natural to the man of communist society in which culture will not be counterposed to the individual as something given to him from outside, something independent and alien, but will be the form of his own real activity. In communist society, as Marx showed, it will become immediately obvious that all forms of culture are only forms of the activity of man himself, which is only brought to light in the conditions of bourgeois society by a theoretical analysis dispelling the illusions inevitable under them. Everything that has a fixed form, such as the product, etc., appears as merely a moment, a vanishing moment, in this movement. The conditions and objectifications of the process are themselves equally moments of it, and its only subjects are the individuals, but individuals in mutual relationships, which they equally reproduce and produce anew. The constant process of their own movement, in which they renew themselves even as they renew the world of wealth they create. A consistently materialist conception of thought, of course, alters the approach to the key problems of logic in a cardinal way, in particular to interpretation of the nature of logical categories. Marx and Engels established above all that the external world was not given to the individual as it was in itself simply and directly in his contemplation, but only in the course of its being altered by man. And that both the contemplating man himself and the world contemplated were products of history. The forms of thought, too, the categories, were accordingly understood not as simple abstractions from unhistorically understood sensuousness, but primarily as universal forms of social man's sensuously objective activity reflected in consciousness. The real objective equivalent of logical forms was seen not simply in the abstract, general contours of the object contemplated by the individual but in the 26 Grundriss, MECW Vol 29, page 98. Problems of dialectics. 93. Forms of men's real activity transforming nature in accordance with his own ends. It is precisely the alteration of nature by men, not solely nature as such, which is the most essential and immediate basis of human thought. And it is the measure that man has earned to change nature that his intelligence has increased. The subject of thought here already proved to be the individual in the nexus of social relations, the socially determined individual, all the forms of whose life activity were given not by nature, but by history, by the process of the molding of human culture. The forms of human activity are consequently laid down in the course of history independently of the will and consciousness of individuals, to whom they are counterposed as the forms of a historically developed system of culture. A system that does not develop at all according to the laws of psychology, since the development of social consciousness is not a simple arithmetic sum of psychic process but a special process governed in general and on the whole by the laws of development of society's material life. These laws not only do not depend on the will and consciousness of individuals but, on the contrary, also actively determine that will and consciousness. The separate individual does not develop the universal forms of human activity by himself, and cannot do so, whatever the powers of abstraction he possesses, but assimilates them ready-made in the course of his own acquiring of culture. Together with language and the knowledge expressed in it, psychological analysis of the active reflection of the external world in the individual head therefore cannot be the means of developing logic. The individual thinks only insofar as he has already mastered the general determinations historically molded before him and completely independently of him. And psychology as a science does not investigate the development of human culture or civilization, rightly considering it a premise independent of the individual. While Hegel's recording of these facts led him to idealism, Marx and Engels, having considered the real prototype of logical definitions and laws in the concrete, universal forms and laws of social man's objective activity, cut off any possibility of subjectivist interpretation of the activity itself. Man does not act on nature from outside, but confronts nature as one of her own forces, and his objective activity is therefore linked at every stage with, and mediated by, objective natural laws. Man makes use of the mechanical, physical, and chemical properties of things as means of exerting power over other things, and in order to make these other things subservient to his aims. Thus nature becomes an instrument of his activities. An instrument with which he supplements his own bodily organs, adding a cubit and more to his stature, scripture notwithstanding. It is just in that the secret of the universality of human activity lies, which idealism passes off as the consequence of reason operating in man. The universality of man appears in practice precisely in the universality which makes all nature his inorganic body, both inasmuch as nature is his direct means of life, and the material, the object, and the instrument of his life activity. Nature is man's inorganic body, nature, that is, insofar as it is not itself the human body. The laws of human activity are therefore also, above all, laws of the natural material from which man's inorganic body, the objective body of civilization, is built, i.e. laws of the movement and change of the objects of nature, transformed into the organs of man. Into moments of the process of production of society's material life. In labor man makes one object of nature act on another object of the same nature in accordance with their own properties and laws of existence. Marx and Engels showed that the logical forms of man's action were the consequences of real laws of human actions on objects, i.e. of practice in all its scope and development, laws that are independent of any thinking. Practice under 27 Engels, Dialectics of Nature, MECW Vol 25, page 511, 28 Capital, MECW Vol 35, page 187, 29 Ibid, page 189, 30 Estranged Labor, MECW Vol 3, page 275-76. Problems of dialectics. 94. Stood materialistically, appeared as a process in whose movement each object involved in it functioned in accordance with its own laws, bringing its own form and measure to light in the changes taking place in it. Thus mankind's practice is a fully concrete process, and at the same time a universal one. It includes all other forms and types of the movement of matter as its abstract moments, and takes place in conformity with their laws. The general laws governing man's changing of nature therefore transpire to be also general laws of the change of nature itself, revealed by man's activity, and not by orders foreign to it, dictated from outside. The universal laws of man's changing of nature are also universal laws of nature only in accordance with which can man successfully alter it. Once realized they also appear as laws of reason, as logical laws. Their specificity consists precisely in their universality, i.e. in the fact that they are not only laws of subjectivity, and not only of objective reality, but also laws governing the movement both of objective reality and of subjective human life activity. That does not mean at all, of course, that thought does not in general possess any specific features worthy of study. As a special process possessing features specifically distinguishing it from the movement of objective reality, i.e. as a psychophysiological faculty of the human individual, thought has, of course, to be subjected to very detailed study in psychology and the physiology of the higher nervous system, but not in logic. In subjective consciousness these laws appear as plenipotentiaries of the rights of the object, as its universal, ideal image. The laws of logic are the reflections of the objective in the subjective consciousness of man. 9. On the coincidence of logic with dialectics and the theory of knowledge of materialism. Like any other science, logic is concerned with explaining and systematizing objective forms and patterns not dependent on men's will and consciousness, within which human activity, both material objective and mental theoretical, takes place. Its subject matter is the objective laws of subjective activity. Such a conception is quite unacceptable to traditional logic since, from the standpoint of the latter, it unites the unjoinable, i.e. an affirmation and its negation, a and not a, opposing predicates. For the subjective is not objective, and vice versa, but the state of affairs in the real world and in the science comprehending it also proves unacceptable to traditional logic, because in it the transition, formation, and transformation of things and processes prove to be the essence of the matter at every step. Traditional logic is consequently inadequate to the real practice of scientific and therefore has to be brought into correspondence with the latter. Marx and Engels showed that science and practice, quite independently of consciously acquired logical notions, developed in accordance with the universal laws that had been described by the dialectical tradition in philosophy. It can happen, even in situations when each separate representative of science involved in its general progress is consciously guided by undialectical ideas about thought. Science as a whole, through the clash of undialectical opinions mutually provoking and correcting one another, develops for all that in accordance with the logic of a higher type and order. The theoretician who has succeeded finally in finding the concrete solution to some contentious problem or other has been objectively forced to think dialectically. Genuine logical necessity drives a road for itself in this case despite the theoretician's consciousness, instead of being realized purposively and freely. It therefore transpires that the greatest theoreticians and natural scientists, whose work has determined the main lines of development of science, have been guided as a rule by the dialectical traditions in logic. Thus Albert Einstein owed much to Spinoza, and Heisenberg to Plato, and so on. 31 Lenin's Philosophical Notebooks, LCW Vol 38, page 183. Problems of dialectics. 95. Taking this conception as their starting point, Marx, Engels, and Lenin established that it was dialectics, and only dialectics, that was the real logic in accordance with which modern thought made progress. It was it, too, that operated at the growing points of modern science, although the representatives of science were not wholly conscious of the fact. That was why logic as a science coincided not only with dialectics but also with the theory of knowledge of materialism. In capital Marx applied to a single science logic, dialectics, and the theory of knowledge of materialism, is how Lenin categorically formulated it. The problem of the relation of logic, the theory of knowledge, and dialectics occupied a special place in Lenin's work. One can say, without danger of exaggeration, that it forms the core of all his special philosophical reflections, to which he returned again and again, each time formulating his conception and solution more succinctly and categorically. In Lenin's reflections, especially those arising in the course of critical rethinking of Hegelian structures, two themes are clearly distinguished: the interrelation between logic and epistemology, and the conception of dialectics as a science that includes its own scientific, theoretical solution of problems that are traditionally isolated from it in the form of logic and the theory of knowledge. Reconstruction of the considerations that enabled Lenin to formulate the position of modern materialism so categorically is very important for the simple reason that no unanimous interpretation of his propositions has yet been reached in Soviet philosophy. Although the direct object of the critical analysis documented in the philosophical notebooks was first and foremost Hegel's conception, it would of course be a mistake to see in that book only a critical commentary on Hegel's works. Lenin was concerned, it goes without saying, not with Hegel as such but with the real content of problems that still preserve their urgent significance to this day. In other words, Lenin undertook, in the form of a critical analysis of the Hegelian conception, a survey of the state of affairs in philosophy in his own day, comparing and evaluating the means of posing and resolving its cardinal problems. Quite naturally, the problem of scientific knowledge came to the fore, around which, and more clearly as time went on, all world philosophical thought revolved at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. Here is how Lenin depicted the aim of his investigations, the theme of logic, to be compared with present-day epistemology. The inverted commas enclosing the word epistemology are not there quite by chance. The fact is that the isolation of a number of old philosophical problems in a special philosophical science is a fact of recent origin. The term itself came into currency only in the latter half of the 19th century as the designation of a special science, of a special field of investigation that had not been sharply distinguished in any way in the classical philosophical systems, and had not constituted either a special science or even a special division, although it would be an error, of course, to affirm that knowledge in general and scientific knowledge in particular had only become the subject of specially close attention with the development of epistemology. The setting up of epistemology as a special science was associated historically and essentially with the broad spread of neo-Kantianism, which became, during the last third of the 19th century, the most influential trend in the bourgeois philosophical thought of Europe, and was converted into the officially recognized school of professorial, university philosophy, first in Germany, and then in all those areas of the world from which people came to the German universities hoping to study serious professional philosophy there. Neo-Kantianism owed its spread not least to the traditional fame of Germany as the home of Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. 32 Lenin's Philosophical Notebooks, LCW Vol 38, page 319, 33 edit, page 103. Problems of dialectics. 96. Its special feature was not at all, of course, the discovery of knowledge as the central philosophical problem, but the specific form in which it was posed, which boiled down to the following. It is accepted to call the doctrine of knowledge, inquiring into the conditions by which indisputably existing knowledge becomes possible. And limits are established in accordance with these conditions up to which any knowledge whatsoever can be extended but beyond which there opens up the sphere of equally undemonstrable opinions, the theory of knowledge or epistemology. The theory of knowledge, of course, together with the tasks mentioned above, rightly poses itself yet other, and supplementary, tasks. But if it wants to be a science making sense, it must, above all, concern itself with explaining the problem of the existence or non-existence of boundaries to knowledge. The Russian Kantian A. Ivedinsky, author of the definition just quoted, very accurately and clearly indicated the special feature of the science that it is accepted to call epistemology in the literature of the Neo-Kantian trend, and in all the schools that have arisen under its predominant influence. Dozens of similar formulations could be cited from the classical authors of Neo-Kantianism and the work of such representatives of daughter branches as Schupp and Wehimer. The job of the theory of knowledge, consequently, was considered to be the establishment of limits of knowledge, boundaries that knowledge could not cross in any circumstances, or however high the development of the cognitive capacities of a person or of humanity, or of the technique of scientific experiment and research. These limits differentiated the sphere of what was knowable in principle from that of what was in principle unknowable, extralimital, transcendent. They were not determined at all by the limitation of human experience in space and time. In that case, extension of the sphere of experience would constantly widen them, and the problem would boil down simply to differentiation between what was already known and what was not yet known but was, in principle, knowable, but by the eternal and immutable nature of men's psychophysiological peculiarities through which all external influences were refracted. These specific mechanisms, by which alone the external world was given to man, were those that generated the limit beyond which lay what was in principle unknowable. What was unknowable in principle proved to be nothing more nor less than the real world lying outside man's consciousness, as it was before its appearance in consciousness. In other words, epistemology was distinguished as a special science in this tradition only on the grounds of a priori acceptance of the thesis that human knowledge was not knowledge of the external world, i.e. existing outside consciousness, but was only a process of the ordering, organization, and systematization of facts of inner experience, i.e. ultimately of the psychophysiological states of the human organism, absolutely dissimilar to the states and events of the external world. That meant that any science, be it physics or political economy, mathematics or history, did not tell us anything about just how matters stood in the external world, because in fact it described only facts arising within ourselves. The psychophysiological phenomena illusorily perceived as a sum of external facts. For the sake of special proof of this thesis, a special science epistemology was created that concerned itself exclusively with the inner conditions of knowledge and purged them carefully of any dependence whatsoever on the effect of external conditions. Above all, of a condition such as the existence of an external world with its own objective laws. Epistemology was thus distinguished as a special science counterposed to ontology, and not at all as a discipline investigating the real course of human knowledge of the surrounding world, quite the contrary. It was born as a doctrine postulating that every form of knowledge. 34 A. Ivedinsky, Logika как часть теории познания, Moscow 1923, page 29. Problems of dialectics. 97. Without exception was not a form of knowledge of the surrounding world but only a specific schema of the organization of the subject of knowledge. From the standpoint of this theory of knowledge, any attempt to interpret existing knowledge as knowledge of the surrounding world was impermissible metaphysics, ontologization of purely subjective forms of activity, an illusory attributing of determinations of the subject to things in themselves, to the world outside consciousness. By metaphysics and ontology then was meant not so much a special science of the world as a whole, a universal scheme of the world, as the whole aggregate of real, so-called positive sciences. So that the main fervor of Neo-Kantian epistemologism proved to be directed precisely against the idea of a scientific world outlook, of a scientific understanding of the world realized in the real sciences themselves. A scientific world outlook, according to this view, was an absurdity, nonsense, since science in general knew nothing about the world outside consciousness and did not speak of it. Under the scornful term metaphysics, Neo-Kantians therefore in fact refused the laws and patterns discovered and formulated by physics, chemistry, biology, political economy, history, etc., any philosophical significance as a world outlook. From their point of view, metaphysics could not be a science, and science could not and had no right to play the role of metaphysics, i.e. to lay claim to an objective meaning for its statements. A world outlook therefore also could not be scientific, because it was the connected aggregate of views of the world within which man lived, acted, and thought. And science was not in a position to unite its achievements in a world outlook without thereby falling into difficulties that were unresolvable for it, into contradictions. This had already, allegedly, been demonstrated once and for all by Kant. It was impossible to build a world outlook from the data of science. But why not, precisely? Because the very principles of knowledge, which were the conditions for the possibility of any scientific synthesis of notions into concepts, judgments, and inferences, i.e. into categories, at the same time also proved to be the conditions of the impossibility of achieving a full synthesis of all scientific ideas into the body of a connected, united, and non-contradictory picture of the world. And that, in the language of Kantians, meant that a world outlook built on scientific principles was impossible in principle. In a scientific world outlook there were always flaws of contradictions cracking it to bits that were unconnectable with one another without flagrant breach of the supreme principle of all analytical judgments. The principle of contradiction in scientific determinations. Man could unite and connect the isolated fragments of the scientific picture of the world into a higher unity in one way only, by breaking his own supreme principles, or, what was the same thing, by turning on scientific schemas of the coupling of ideas in a united whole into the principles of synthesis, since the latter had no relation with the principle of contradiction, but were the principles of faith and opinion. Dogmas that were equally undemonstrable and uncontrovertible scientifically, and were acceptable solely according to irrational whims, sympathy, conscience, etc., etc. Only faith was capable of synthesizing the fragments of knowledge into a united picture at those points where all attempts to do so by means of science were doomed to failure. Hence the slogan specific to all Kantians of the uniting of science and faith, of the logical principles of the construction of a scientific picture of the world and of irrational precepts. Compensating the powerlessness organically built into the intellect to accomplish the highest synthesis of knowledge. Only within the limits described above could the meaning of the Kantian posing of the problem of the relation of logic to the theory of knowledge be understood. Logic as such was interpreted by all Kantians as part of the theory of knowledge. Occasionally this part was given the main significance and it almost swallowed the whole, for example, in the variants of Cohen and Natorp, Cassirer and Rickert. Problems of dialectics. 98. Vedinsky and Chelpanov, and occasionally it was relegated to a more modest place, subordinated to the other parts of the theory of knowledge, but logic was always part. The theory of knowledge was broader, because its job was wider, since reason was not the sole, though the most important, means of processing the data of sensations, perceptions, and ideas into the form of knowledge, into concepts and a system of concepts, into science. Logic, therefore, in the Kantian interpretation, never covered the whole field of the problems of the theory of knowledge. Beyond it lay an analysis of processes affected by other aptitudes, that is to say, perception, and intuition, and memory, and imagination, and many others. Logic, as the theory of discursive thought, which moved in rigorous determinations and in strict accord with rules clearly realizable and formulatable, only partly did the job of the theory of knowledge, only through analysis of its own object. Singled out from the whole complex of cognitive faculties. The main job of the theory of knowledge, however, thus also remained logic's chief task, i.e. to establish the limits of knowledge and clarify the inner limitedness of the possibilities of thought in the course of constructing a world outlook. Logic therefore had neither the least connection nor least relation with understanding of the real world of things in themselves. It was applicable solely to things already realized, i.e. to the psychic phenomena of human culture. Its special task was rigorous analysis of the already available images of consciousness, i.e. their resolution into simple components, expressed in strictly defined terms, and the reverse operation. The synthesis or linking together of the components into complex systems of determinations again by the same rigorously established rules. Logic must also demonstrate that real discursive thought was incapable of leading knowledge beyond the limits of existing consciousness, or of crossing the boundaries dividing the phenomenal world from the world of things in themselves. Thought, if it were logical, could not concern itself with things in themselves, and had no right to. So that, even within the boundaries of knowledge, thought was assigned in turn a limited field of legitimate application, within which the rules of logic were binding and obligatory. The laws and rules of logic were inapplicable to the images of perception as such, to sensations, to ideas, to the phantoms of mythology's consciousness, including in that the idea of God, of the immortality of the soul, and so on. But they did, and had to, serve as filters, as it were, retaining these images at the boundaries of scientific knowledge, and only that. To judge whether these images were true in themselves, whether they played a positive or a negative role in the body of spiritual culture, thought oriented on logic had neither the possibilities nor the right. In fact, there was not and could not be a rationally substantiated, scientifically verified position in relation to any image of consciousness if it arose before and independently of the special logical activity of the mind, before and outside science. In science, inside its specific limits defined by logic, the existence of such images was inadmissible. Beyond its limits their existence was sovereign, outside the jurisdiction of reason and comprehension and therefore morally and epistemologically inviolable. Considering the special features of the Kantian interpretation of the relation of logic and epistemology, one can understand the close attention that Lenin paid to Hegel's solution of this problem. In Hegel's understanding of the matter, logic as a whole and in full, without irrational vestiges, embraced the whole field of the problems of knowledge and left no images of contemplation or fantasy outside its boundaries. It included their examination as external products of the real force of thought, because they were thought itself, only embodied not in words, judgments, and conclusions, deductions and inferences, but in things sensibly opposed to the individual consciousness. Logic merged here with the theory of knowledge because all other cognitive faculties were considered as forms of thought, as thinking that had not yet attained an adequate form of expression, had not yet matured to it. Here we come up against the extreme expression, as it were, of Hegel's absolute idealism, according to which the whole world, and not only the cognitive faculties, was interpreted as alienated or problems of dialectics. 99. Estranged thought that has not yet arrived at itself. With that, of course, Lenin as a consistent materialist could not agree. It is very indicative, however, that Lenin formulated his attitude to the Hegelian solution very cautiously. In this conception, logic coincides with the theory of knowledge. This is in general a very important question. We have succeeded, it seems, in demonstrating just why, in the course of Lenin's reading of Hegel's logic, this problem appeared more and more clearly to him to be very important, and perhaps the most important of all, why Lenin's thought returned to it again and again. In circles as it were, each time becoming more and more definite and categorical. The fact is that the Kantian conception of logic, generally accepted at the time, as part of the theory of knowledge, by no means remained an abstract, philosophical, theoretical construction. The Kantian theory of knowledge defined the limits of the competence of science in general, leaving the most acute problems as regards world outlook beyond its limits, and declaring them transcendental for logical thought, i.e. for theoretical knowledge and solution. But in this case the union of scientific investigation and faith in the corpus of a world outlook would be not only permissible but necessary. And it was in fact under the banner of Kantianism that the revisionist stream surged forward in the socialist movement. The Kantian theory of knowledge was directly oriented here on uniting rigorous scientific thought with ethical values and undemonstrable and irrefutable faith in the transcendental postulates of the good, of conscience, of love of one's neighbor and of the whole human race without exception. And so on and so forth. The harm done to the working class movement by the propagation of higher values was not, of course, the talk about conscience being good and lack of conscience bad, or about love of the human race being preferable to hatred of it. The harm of the Kantian idea of uniting science with a system of higher ethical values consisted in principle in its orienting theoretical thought itself along lines other than those along which the teaching of Marx and Engels had been developed. It plotted its own, Kantian strategy of scientific research for social, democratic theoreticians and confused ideas on the main line of development of theoretical thought and on the lines along which theoretical solution of the real problems of modern times could and should be sought. The Kantian theory of knowledge turned theoretical thinking not to analysis of the material, economic relations between people that form the foundation of the whole pyramid of social relations, but to elaborating of far-fetched ethical constructions, morally interpretable policies, and social psychology of the Berdiaev kind, and to other things, which were interesting but absolutely useless to the working class movement. The orientation of theoretical thought not on the logic of capital but on moral fictional harping on the secondary, derivative defects of the capitalist system in its secondary, superstructural stories, led to the decisive, dominant trends of the new imperialist stage of the development of capitalism escaping the notice of the theoreticians of the Second International, not because they lacked talent, but rather because of a petty bourgeois class orientation in a false epistemological position. In this respect the fate of Rudolf Hilferding and H.W.C. Kuhnau was very characteristic. Insofar as they tried to develop Marx's political economy by means of the latest logical devices, rather than of dialectics, it inevitably degenerated into a superficial classificatory description of contemporary economic phenomena, i.e. into a quite uncritical acceptance of them. Into an apologia. This path led directly to Karl Renner and his theory of the capitalist economy, the Bible of right-wing socialism, which was already linked, as regards its method of thinking and logic of investigation, with vulgar positivist epistemology. Renner's philosophical credo was as follows: Marx is capital, written in an age far removed from us, with a quite different way of thinking, and a manner of exposition not worked out to the end, with every new decade increases the reader's difficulties. The style of writing of the German philosopher. 35 Lenin's Philosophical Notebooks, LCW Vol 38, page 175. Problems of Dialectics. 100. First has become foreign to us. Marx came from a very philosophical age. Science today no longer proceeds deductively, but rather inductively. It starts from experimentally established facts, systematizes them and so by degrees arrives at the level of abstract concepts. For an age that is so accustomed to think and to read, the first section of Marx's principal work presents sheer insuperable difficulty. The orientation on modern science and the modern way of thinking, already begun with Bernstein, turned into an orientation on the idealistic and agnostic vogue interpretations of modern science, on Humean Berkeleyan and Kantian epistemology. Lenin saw that quite clearly. From the middle of the 19th century, bourgeois philosophy frankly moved back to Kant, and further back to Hume and Berkeley, and Hegel's logic, despite all its absolute idealism, was more and more clearly depicted as the pinnacle of the development of all pre-Marxian philosophy in the field of logic, understood as the theory of the development of scientific knowledge, as the theory of knowledge. Lenin repeatedly stressed that it was only possible to move forward from Hegel along one line and one line only, that of a materialist reworking of his achievements. Because Hegel's absolute idealism had really exhausted all the possibilities of idealism as a principle for understanding thought, knowledge, and scientific consciousness. But, because of certain circumstances lying outside science, only Marx and Engels had been able to take that line. It was closed to bourgeois philosophy, and the slogan back to Kant was imperiously dictated by the fear aroused in the bourgeoisie's ideologists by the social perspectives opened up from the heights of the dialectical view of thought. From the moment the materialist view of history appeared, Hegel was seen by bourgeois consciousness as none other than the spiritual father of Marxism. That had a considerable grain of truth, too, for Marx and Engels had disclosed the genuine sense of Hegel's main achievement, dialectics, and demonstrated not only the constructive, creative power of its principles, understood as the principles of men's rational attitude to the world, but also their revolutionary, destructive force. Why then did Lenin, while fighting Hegel's absolute idealism, begin to join sides with him more and more just at that point where the idealism seemed in fact to become absolute? For surely the conception of logic as a science embracing in its principles not only human thought but also the real world outside consciousness was linked with panlogism, with the interpretation of the forms and laws of the real world as alienated forms of thought, and thought itself as the absolute force and power organizing the world. The fact is that Hegel was and remains the sole thinker before Marx who consciously introduced practice into logic with full rights as the criterion both of truth and of the correctness of the operations that man performs in the sphere of the verbal, symbolic explication of his psychic states. In Hegel, logic became identified with the theory of knowledge precisely because man's practice, i.e. realization of the aims of the spirit in sense objects, in natural, physical material was brought into the logical process as a phase, was looked upon as thought in its external revelation, in the course of checking its results through direct contact with things in themselves. Lenin traced the development of Hegel's corresponding ideas with special scrupulousness. The practice of man and of mankind is the test, the criterion of the objectivity of cognition. Is that Hegel's idea? It is necessary to return to this, he wrote. And returning to it, he wrote confidently, and quite categorically, undoubtedly, in Hegel practice serves as a link in the analysis of the process of cognition, and indeed as the transition to objective truth. Marx, consequently, clearly sides with Hegel in introducing the criterion of practice into the theory of knowledge. See the theses on Feuerbach. 36 Karl Renner, Die Wirtschaft als Gesamtprozess und die Sozialisierung, Berlin 1924, page 5, 37 Lenin's Philosophical Notebooks, LCW Vol 38, page 211, 38 Ibid, page 212. Problems of Dialectics. 101. In appearing as a practical act, thought included things outside consciousness and its movement, and then it turned out that the things in themselves were subordinated to the dictates of thinking man and obediently moved and changed according to laws and schemas dictated by his thought. Thus not only did the spirit move according to logical schemas, but also the world of things in themselves. Logic consequently proved to be precisely a theory of knowledge of things also, and not solely a theory of the self-knowledge of the spirit. Formulating the rational kernel of Hegel's conception of the subject matter of logic, Lenin wrote, logic is the science not of external forms of thought, but of the laws of development of all material, natural and spiritual things, i.e. of the development of the entire concrete content of the world and of its cognition, i.e. the sum total, the conclusion of the history of knowledge of the world. There is no such a formulation, and furthermore no such a conception of the subject matter of logic in Hegel himself. In this passage Lenin did not simply translate Hegel's thought into his own words, but reworked it materialistically. Hegel's own text, in which Lenin discovered the rational kernel of his conception of logic, does not sound at all like that. Here it is, the indispensable basis, the concept, the universal, which is thought itself, insofar, that is, as in using the word thought one can abstract from the idea. This cannot be regarded as a merely indifferent form which is attached to some content. But these thoughts of all natural and spiritual things, even the substantial content, are yet such as to possess manifold determinations and to contain the distinction between soul and body. Between a concept and its respective reality, the deeper basis is the soul in itself, the pure concept, which is the very core of objects, their very life pulse, as it is the core and pulse of subjective thinking itself. To bring into clear consciousness this logical character which gives soul to mind and stirs and works in it, this is our problem. The difference between Hegel's formulation and Lenin's is one of principle, because there is nothing in Hegel about the development of natural things, and could not even be. It would therefore be a gross error to think that the definition of logic as the science of the laws of development of all material and spiritual things is only Hegel's idea transmitted by Lenin, or even simply cited by him. It is nothing of the sort, it is Lenin's own idea, formulated by him in the course of a critical reading of Hegel's words. Hegel's logic is also his theory of knowledge for the reason that the science of thought was inferred by him from an investigation of the history of the spirit as self-knowledge, and thus of the world of natural things. Since the latter were considered moments of the logical process, schemas of thought, concepts, alienated in natural material. Logic is also the theory of knowledge of Marxism, but for quite another reason, because the forms themselves of the activity of the spirit, the categories and schemas of logic, are inferred from investigation of the history of humanity's knowledge and practice, i.e. from the process in the course of which thinking man cognizes and transforms the material world. From that standpoint, logic also cannot be anything else than a theory explaining the universal schemas of the development of knowledge and of the material world by social man. As such, it is also a theory of knowledge. Any other definition of the tasks of a theory of knowledge inevitably leads to one version or another of the Kantian conception. In no case, according to Lenin, logic and the theory of knowledge were two different sciences. Even less could logic be defined as part of the theory of knowledge. The logical determinations of thought therefore included exclusively universal categories and laws of the development of the objective world in general cognized in the course of the millennia of the development of scientific culture and tested for objectivity in the crucible of social man's practice, schemas common to both natural and socio-historical development, being reflected in social consciousness, in mankind's spiritual. 39 Ibid, page 92-9340 Hegel's Science of Logic, Transl. A.V. Miller, page 37. Problems of Dialectics. 102. Culture, they functioned as active logical forms of the work of thought, and logic was a systematic, theoretical depiction of the universal schemas, forms, and laws of development of nature and of society, and of thought itself. In this conception, however, logic was fully merged without residue in dialectics. And once more there were not two sciences, however closely linked with one another, but one and the same science, one in subject matter and its stock of concepts. And this, Lenin stressed, was not an aspect of the matter, but the essence of the matter. In other words, unless logic was understood simultaneously as the theory of knowledge, it could not be truly understood. So logic and dialectics, according to Lenin, were in a relationship of full identity, full coincidence of subject matter and stock of categories. Dialectics had no subject matter distinct from that of the theory of knowledge, just as logic had no object of a study that would differ in any way from the subject matter of dialectics. In the one and in the other it was a matter of universal forms and laws of development in general that were reflected in consciousness precisely in the shape of logical forms and laws of thought through the determination of categories. And because categories as schemas of the synthesis of experimental data and concepts had a quite objective significance, the same significance also attached to the experience process with their aid, i.e. to science, the scientific picture of the world, the scientific outlook. Dialectics is the theory of knowledge of Marxism. Lenin wrote in his notes on the question of dialectics, in which he summed up the vast job he had done in several years of hard work on critically reworking the Hegelian conception of logic in a materialist way. This is the aspect of the matter to which Plekhanov, not to speak of other Marxists, paid no attention. That categorical conclusion, hardly admitting of any other interpretation than a literal one, must not be considered as a phrase dropped by chance, but as a real resume of all Lenin's understanding of the problem of the relationship of dialectics, logic, and the theory of knowledge of modern materialism. In the light of the foregoing, attempts to interpret their relation in the body of Marxism in such a way that dialectics is transformed into a special category treating pure forms of being, and logic and the theory of knowledge into special sciences connected with dialectics but not, however, merged with it, and devoted exclusively to the specific forms of the reflection of this ontology in men's consciousness, the one being devoted to the specific forms of knowledge and the other to the specific forms of discursive thought, proved to be bankrupt and in no way linked with Lenin's conception. The idea whereby logic is distinguished from dialectics as the particular from the general and therefore studies just that specific feature of thought from which dialectics digresses, is based on a simple misunderstanding. On neglect of the fact that the specific nature of the forms and laws of thought consists precisely in their universality. Logic as a science is not at all interested in the specific features of the thinking of the physicist or chemist, economist or linguist, but only in those universal forms and laws within which the thinking of any person flows, and of any theoretician, including the logician by profession, who specially thinks about thought. From the angle of materialism, therefore, logic also investigates forms and laws that equally govern both thinking about the external world and thinking about thought itself, and is thus the science of the universal forms and patterns of thought and reality. So that the statement that logic must study the specific forms of the movement of thought as well as the universal ones, in fact ignores the historically formed division of labor between logic and psychology, depriving psychology of its subject matter, and throwing onto logic a task that is too much for it. 41 Lenin's Philosophical Notebooks, LCW Vol 38, page 362. Problems of Dialectics. 103. To understand logic as a science distinguished from dialectics means to understand both logic and dialectics incorrectly, and not in a materialist way, because logic, artificially separated from dialectics, is inevitably converted into a description of purely subjective methods and operations, i.e. of forms of activities depending on the will and consciousness of people, and on the peculiarities of the material, and therefore ceases to be an objective science. While dialectics, counterposed to the process of the development of knowledge, in the form of a doctrine about the world as a whole, in the form of world schematics is just as inevitably converted into extremely general statements about everything on earth and not about anything in particular. Dialectics, understood so, is tacked onto the real process of cognition in a purely formal way, through examples confirming one and the same general proposition over and over again. But it is clear that such a formal superimposition of the general onto the particular does not deepen our understanding of either the general or the particular by a single jot, while dialectics is transformed into a dead scheme. Lenin therefore quite justly considered the transformation of dialectics into a sum of examples as the inevitable consequence of not understanding it as the logic and theory of knowledge of materialism, being the science of the universal forms and patterns within which any process, either objective or subjective, takes place. Logic is a rigorously defined system of special concepts reflecting the stages consecutively passed through in the formation of any concrete whole. The sequence of the development of the categories in the body of a theory has an objective character, i.e. does not depend on the will and consciousness of people. It is dictated primarily by the objective sequence of the development of empirically based theoretical knowledge, in the form of which, the objective sequence of the real historical process, purged of its disruptive fortuities and of the historical form, is reflected in people's consciousness. Logical categories are thus directly stages in distinguishing the world, i.e. of cognizing it, and nodal points helping to cognize and master it. In explaining this view, Lenin remarked on the general sequence of the development of logical categories. First of all, impressions flash by, then something emerges, afterwards the concepts of quality and quantity are developed. After that, study and reflection direct thought to the cognition of identity, difference, ground, essence versus phenomenon, causality, etc. All these moments of cognition move, from subject to object, being tested in practice and arriving through this test at truth. Such is actually the general course of all human cognition in general. Such is the course also of natural science and political economy. The movement of scientific cognition, Lenin said, was the knob. Logical categories are stages in cognition developing the object in its necessity, in the natural sequence of the phases of its own formation, and not at all man's technical devices imposed on the subject like a child's bucket on sand pies. Not only do the determinations of each of the logical categories therefore have an objective character, i.e. determine the object and not simply the form of subjective activity, but the sequence in which the categories appear in the theory of thought also has the same necessary character. It is impossible to determine necessity or purpose strictly scientifically. On 42 Engels, Dialectics of Nature, MECW Vol 25, page 505, 43 Lenin's Philosophical Notebooks, LCW Vol 38, page 93, 44 Ibid, page 319, 45 Ibid, page 318, 46 Ibid, page 87. Problems of Dialectics. 104. Objective basis, before and independently of the scientific determination of identity and difference, quality and measure, etc. Just as it is impossible to understand capital and profit scientifically unless their simple components, commodity and money, have previously been analyzed. And just as it is impossible to understand the complex compounds of organic chemistry while their constituent chemical elements are unknown. In outlining a plan for systematic treatment of the categories of logic, Lenin noted, if Marx did not leave behind him a logic, he did leave the logic of capital, and this ought to be utilized to the full in this question. Moreover, one can only distinguish the logical categories underlying the theory of political economy from the movement of the theory by basing oneself on the best traditions in the development of logic as a science. It is impossible completely to understand Marx's Capital, and especially its first chapter, without having thoroughly studied and understood the whole of Hegel's logic. In his Capital, Lenin wrote further, Marx first analyses the simplest, most ordinary and fundamental, most common and everyday relation of bourgeois society, a relation encountered billions of times, viz. the exchange of commodities. In this very simple phenomenon, analysis reveals all the contradictions of modern society. The subsequent exposition shows us the development of these contradictions and of this society in the Greek letter sigma of its individual parts, from its beginning to its end. Such must also be the method of exposition of dialectics in general. 10. Contradiction as a category of dialectical logic. Contradiction as the concrete unity of mutually exclusive opposites is the real nucleus of dialectics, its central category. On that score there cannot be two views among Marxists, but no small difficulty immediately arises as soon as matters touch on subjective dialectics, on dialectics as the logic of thinking. If any object is a living contradiction, what must the thought be that expresses it? Can and should an objective contradiction find reflection in thought? And if so, in what form? Contradiction in the theoretical determinations of an object is above all a fact that is constantly being reproduced by the movement of science, and is not denied by dialectics or by materialists or idealists. The point that they dispute is something else, namely, what is the relationship of the contradiction in thought to the object? In other words, can there be a contradiction in true, correct thought? The metaphysical logician tries to demonstrate the inapplicability of the dialectical law of the coincidence or concurrence of opposites, which amounts to their identity, to the very process of thought. Such logicians are occasionally prepared even to recognize that the object can, in agreement with dialectics, be by itself inwardly contradictory. The contradiction is in the object but must not be in the ideas about it. The metaphysician, however, still cannot permit himself in any way to recognize the truth of the law that constitutes the nucleus of dialectics, in relation to the logical process. The principle of contradiction is transformed into an absolute, formal criterion of truth, into an indisputable a priori canon, into the supreme principle of logic. Some logicians strive to substantiate this position, which it is difficult to call other than eclectic, by citing the practice of science. Any science, when it comes up against a contradiction in determinations of an object, always strives to resolve it. In that case, does it not act in accordance with the recipes of metaphysics, which holds that any contradiction in thought is inadmissible, and something that must be? 47 Ibid, page 319, 48 Ibid, page 180, 49 Ibid, page 360-61. Problems of dialectics. 105. Got rid of somehow or other, the metaphysician in logic interprets similar moments in the development of science in such a way. Science, he says, always strives to avoid contradictions, but in dialectics there is an opposite tendency. The view under consideration is based on a misunderstanding, or rather simply on ignorance of the important historical fact that dialectics was born just where metaphysical thought finally became caught up in the logical contradictions it had brought to light just because it persistently and consistently observed the ban on any kind of contradiction whatsoever in determinations. Dialectics as logic is the means of resolving these contradictions, so that it is stupid to accuse it of an itch to pile up contradictions. It is irrational to see the cause of the illness in the coming of the doctor. The question can only be whether dialectics is successful in curing the contradictions into which thought falls, in fact, as a result of a most rigorous metaphysical diet that unconditionally forbids any contradiction. And if it is successful, just why is it? Let us turn to the analysis of a striking example, a typical case of how mountains of logical contradictions have been piled up just by means of absolutist formal logic, and rationally resolved only by means of dialectical logic. We have in mind the history of political economy, the history of the disintegration of the Ricardian school and the rise of Marx's economic theory. The way out of the blind alley of the theoretical paradoxes and antinomies into which the Ricardian school had got was found, as we know, only by Karl Marx, and was found precisely by means of dialectics as logic. That Ricardo's theory contained a mass of logical contradictions was not discovered by Marx at all. It was plainly seen by Malthus, and Sismondi, and McCulloch, and Proudhon. But only Marx was able to understand the real character of the contradictions of the labor theory of value. Let us, following Marx, consider one of them, the most typical and acute, the antinomy of the law of value and the law of the average rate of profit. David Ricardo's law of value established that living human labor was the sole source and substance of value, an affirmation that was an enormous advance on the road to objective truth. But profit was also value. In trying to express it theoretically, i.e. through the law of value, a clear logical contradiction was obtained. The point was that profit was new, newly created value, or rather part of it. That was an indisputably true analytical determination, but only new labor produced new value. How, however, did that tie up with the quite obvious empirical fact that the quantity of profit was not determined at all by the quantity of living labor expended on its production? It depended exclusively on the quantity of capital as a whole, and in no case on the size of that part that went on wages, and it was even more paradoxical that the higher the profit the less living labor was consumed during its production. In Ricardo's theory, the law of the average rate of profit, which established the dependence of the scale of profit on the quantity of capital as a whole, and the law of value, which established that only living labor produced new value, stood in a relation of direct, mutually exclusive contradiction. Nevertheless, both laws determined one and the same object. This antinomy was noted with spiteful delight in his day by Malthus. Here then was a problem that it was impossible to resolve on the principles of formal logic, and if thought had arrived here at an antinomy, and had landed in a logical contradiction, it was difficult to blame dialectics for it. Neither Ricardo nor Malthus had any idea of dialectics. Both knew only the Lockean theory of understanding and the logic corresponding to it. Its canons were indisputable for them, and the only ones. This logic justified a general law only when it was demonstrated as an immediately general empirical rule under which all facts whatsoever were subsumed without contradiction. It was found that there was in fact no such relationship between the law of value and the forms of its manifestation. As soon as one tried to treat profit theoretically, it suddenly proved to be an absurd contradiction. If the law of value was universal, profit was. Problems of dialectics. 106. Impossible in principle. By its existence it refuted the abstract universality of the law of value, the law of its own particular existence. Ricardo, the creator of the labor theory of value, was primarily concerned with the accord of the theoretical statements with the object. He soberly, and even cynically, expressed the real state of affairs, and the latter, riddled with unresolvable antagonisms, was naturally presented in thought as a system of conflicts, antagonisms, and logical contradictions. This circumstance, which bourgeois theoreticians regarded as evidence of the weakness and incompleteness of his theory, was evidence rather of the contrary, of its strength and objectivity. When Ricardo's disciples and successors no longer made correspondence of theory to the object their chief concern, but rather agreement of the developed theoretical determinations with the requirements of formal logical consistence, with the canons of the formal unity of theory, the labor theory of value began to disintegrate. Marx wrote of James Mill, what he tries to achieve is formal, logical consistence. The disintegration of the Ricardian school therefore begins with him. In fact, as Marx showed, the general law of value stood in a relation of mutually exclusive contradiction with the empirical form of its own manifestation, with the law of the average rate of profit. That was a real contradiction of a real object, and it was not surprising that, in trying to subsume the one law directly and immediately under the other, a logical contradiction was obtained. But when, nevertheless, they continued trying to make value and profit agree directly and without contradiction, they then obtained a problem that was, in Marx's words, much more difficult to solve than that of squaring the circle. It is simply an attempt to present that which does not exist as in fact existing. The metaphysically thinking theoretician, coming up against such a paradox, inevitably interprets it as the result of mistakes committed earlier in thought, in the working out and formulation of the universal law. And he naturally seeks a solution of the paradox by way of a purely formal analysis of the theory, by making the concepts more precise, by correcting expressions, and so on. Apropos of this approach to solving the problem, Marx wrote, "Here the contradiction between the general law and further developments in the concrete circumstances is to be resolved not by the discovery of the connecting links but by directly subordinating and immediately adapting the concrete to the abstract. This moreover is to be brought about by a verbal fiction, by changing vera rerum vocabula. When the general law contradicts the empirically common position of things, the empiricist immediately sees the way out in altering the formulation of the general law in such a fashion that the empirically general will be directly subsumed under it. At first glance that is how it ought to be. If thought contradicts the facts, then the thought should be altered so as to bring it into line with the general phenomena immediately given on the surface. In fact, this is theoretically false, and by taking it the Ricardian school arrived at complete rejection of the labor theory of value. The general law revealed by Ricardo was sacrificed to crude empiria, but the crude empiricism was inevitably converted into a false metaphysics, scholasticism, which toils painfully to deduce undeniable empirical phenomena by simple formal abstraction directly from the general law, or to show by cunning argument that they are in accordance with that law. Formal logic, and the metaphysics that made it an absolute, knew only two ways of resolving contradictions in thought. The first was to adjust the general law to the directly general, empirically obvious, state of affairs, that, as we have seen, brought about loss of the concept of value. The second way. 50 Theories of Surplus Value, Part 3, MECW Vol 32 page 258, 51 Theories of Surplus Value, Part 3 inches MECW Vol 32 page 277, 52 Idid, MECW Vol 32 page 277 853 Theories of Surplus Value, Part 1 MECW Vol 30 page 395. Problems of Dialectics. 107. Was to represent the internal contradiction, express thinking as a logical contradiction, as an external contradiction of two things, each of which was, in itself, non-contradictory. A procedure known as reducing the internal contradiction to a contradiction in different relations or at a different time. It was done as follows. Profit could not be explained from value without contradiction? Well, what of it? There was no need to persist in a one-sided approach. One must admit that profit originated in reality not only from labor but also from many other factors. It was necessary role of land, and of machines, and of demand, and of many other account. The point, they said, lay not in the contradictions but in the fullness. So the triune formula of vulgar economics: capital, interest, land, rent, labor, wages. There was no logical contradiction there, it is true. It had disappeared, but with it, too, had disappeared the theoretical approach to things in general. The conclusion was obvious. Not every means of resolving the contradictions led to development of the theory. The two ways outlined above signified a solution such as was identical with converting the theory into empirical eclecticism. Because theory in general existed only where there was a conscious and principled striving to understand all the separate phenomena as necessary and the same general, concrete substance, in this instance the substance of value, of living human labor. The only theoretician who succeeded in resolving the logical contradictions of the Ricardian theory so as to bring about not disintegration but real development of the labor theory of value was, of course, Karl Marx. What did his dialectical materialist method of resolving the antinomy consist in? First of all, we must state that the real contradictions discovered by Ricardo did not disappear in Marx's system. Furthermore, they were presented in it as necessary contradictions of the object itself, and not at all as the result of mistakenness of the idea, or of inexactitudes and determinations. In the first volume of Capital, for example, it is demonstrated that surplus value is exclusively the product of that part of capital which is expended on wages and converted into living labor, i.e. variable capital. The proposition in the third volume, however, reads, however that may be, the outcome is that surplus value springs simultaneously from all portions of the invested capital. Between the first and the second propositions a whole system was developed, a whole chain of connecting links. Between them, nevertheless, there was preserved a relationship of mutually exclusive contradiction banned by formal logic. That is why vulgar economists triumphantly declared, after the appearance of the third volume of Capital, that Marx had not fulfilled his pledge. That the antinomy of the labor theory of value remained unresolved by him and that the whole of Capital was consequently nothing more than speculative, dialectical hocus pocus. The general is thus also contradicted in Capital by its own particular manifestation, and the contradiction between them does not disappear just because a whole chain of mediating links has been developed between them. On the contrary, this actually demonstrates that the antinomies of the labor theory of value are not logical ones at all but real contradictions in the object, correctly expressed by Ricardo, though not understood by him. In Capital these antinomies are not done away with at all as something subjective, but proved to be understood, i.e. have been sublated in the body of a deeper and more concrete theoretical conception. In other words, they are preserved but have lost the character of logical contradictions, having been converted into abstract moments of the concrete conception of economic reality. And there is nothing surprising in that. Any concrete, developing system includes contradictions as the principle of its self-movement and as the form in which the development is cast. So let us compare how the metaphysician Ricardo and the dialectician Marx understood value. Ricardo, of course, did not analyze value by its form. His abstraction of value, on the one hand, was incomplete, and on the other was formal, and for that reason was untrue. In what, then, did Marx see the fullness and pithiness of the analysis of value that was missing in Ricardo? First, in value being a living concrete contradiction. 54 Capital, Volume 3 inches MECW Vol 37, page 40. Problems of Dialectics. 108. Ricardo showed value only from the aspect of its substance, i.e. took labor as the substance of value. As for Marx, he understood value not only as substance but also as subject. Value was represented as the substance subject of all the developed forms and categories of political economy, and with that conscious dialectics in this science began. Because the subject in Marx's conception is reality developing through its own internal contradictions. But let us look a little closer at Marx's analysis of value. First of all, it investigates the direct, moneyless exchange or barter of commodity for commodity. In exchange, in the course of which one commodity is replaced by another, value is only manifested, is only expressed, and in no case is it created. It is manifested as follows. One commodity plays the role of relative value, and the other, counterposed to it, the role of equivalent. In one expression of value, one commodity cannot simultaneously appear in both forms. These forms are polar opposites, are mutually exclusive. The metaphysician will no doubt be delighted to read that two mutually exclusive economic forms cannot simultaneously be combined in one commodity. But can one say that Marx was refuting the possibility of the coincidence of mutually exclusive determinations in the object and in its conception? Rather the contrary. The fact is that we are not yet concerned with the concept of value, with value as such. The passage cited crowns the analysis of the form of the revelation of value. Value itself still remains a mysterious and theoretically unexpressed essence of each of the commodities. On the surface of phenomena it really appears as if two abstract, one-sided forms of its revelation are visible. But value itself does not coincide with either of these forms, or with their simple, mechanical unity. It is a third something, something lying deeper. In relation to its owner, for example, linen as a commodity appears only in the relative form of value, and in that same relation it cannot be simultaneously an equivalent. But matters appear so only from an abstract, one-sided angle. For the owner of linen is absolutely equal to the owner of a coat, and from the position of the latter the relation under consideration proves directly the opposite, so that we do not have two different relations, but one concrete objective relation. A mutual relation of two commodity owners. From the concrete standpoint, each of the two commodities, linen and coat, mutually measures the other's value and also mutually serves as the material in which it is measured. In other words, each mutually presupposes that the equivalent form of value is realized in the other commodity, the very form in which the latter can no longer be because it is in the relative form. In other words, the exchange really being completed presupposes that each of the two commodities mutually related in it simultaneously takes on both economic forms of the revelation of value in itself, both measuring its own value and serving as the material for expressing the value of the other commodity. And if, from the abstract, one-sided point of view, each of them is only in one form, and functions as relative value in one relation and as equivalent in the other, from the concrete aspect, i.e. in fact, each of the commodities is simultaneously and, moreover, within one and the same relation in both mutually exclusive forms of the expression of value. If the two commodities do not mutually recognize each other as equivalents, exchange simply cannot take place. If, however, exchange does take place, that means that the two polarly excluded forms of value are combined in each of the two commodities. What you get, then, says the metaphysician, is that Marx contradicts himself. How can he say that two polar forms of the expression of value cannot be combined in one commodity, and then state that in real exchange they are all the same so combined? The answer is that concrete examination of things refutes the result obtained by the abstract, one-sided approach to them, and shows it to be untrue. The truth of commodity exchange is just that a relation is realized in it that is absolutely impossible from the angle of an abstract, one-sided view. 55 Capital, Volume 1 MECW Vol 35 page 59. Problems of dialectics. 109. Something else is discovered in the form of the contradiction under consideration, as analysis shows, and that is the absolute content of each of the commodities, its value, the inner contradiction of value and use value. Thus the contrast between use value and value hidden away within the commodity Marx wrote, has an outward and visible counterpart, namely the relation between two commodities, the relation in which the commodity whose value is to be expressed counts only as use value, whereas the commodity in terms of which value is to be expressed counts only as exchange value. The simple value form of a commodity is, therefore, the simple phenomenal form of the inherent contrast between use value and value. From the aspect of logic this point is extraordinarily instructive. The metaphysician, coming up against the fact of the coincidence of contradictory determinations in a concept, in the statement of a thing, sees in it a false theoretical expression and strives to turn the internal contradiction into an external contradiction of two things, each of which, in his view, is internally non-contradictory, into a contradiction in various relations or at a different time. Marx acted quite the contrary. He showed that the inner contradiction hidden in each of the interrelated things in a contradiction of an external order. As a result, value was presented as an inner relation of a commodity to itself, outwardly revealed through the relation to another commodity. The other commodity played only the role of a mirror in which the inwardly contradictory nature of the commodity that expressed its value was reflected. In philosophical terms, the external contradiction was presented only as a phenomenon in the relation to the other commodity as the relation of the commodity to itself. The inner relation, the relation to itself, was also value as the absolute economic content of each of the mutually related commodities. The metaphysician always strives to reduce the internal relation to an external one. For him a contradiction in one relation is an index of the abstractness of knowledge, an index of the confusion of different planes of abstraction, and so on, and an external contradiction is a synonym of the concreteness of knowledge. For Marx, on the contrary, it was an index of the one-sidedness and superficiality of knowledge when an object was presented in thought simply as an external contradiction, signifying that only the outward form of the manifestation of an internal contradiction had been caught, instead of the contradiction itself. Dialectics obliges one always to see, behind a thing's relation to another thing, its own relation to itself, its own inner relation. The difference between dialectics and metaphysics does not consist at all in the former's recognizing only inner contradictions and the latter's recognizing only external ones. Metaphysics really always tries to reduce the inner contradiction to a contradiction in different relations, denying it objective significance. Dialectics by no means reduces the one to the other. It recognizes the objectivity of both. The point, however, does not lie in reducing an external contradiction to an inner one, but in deriving the former from the latter and thus comprehending the one and the other in their objective necessity. Dialectics moreover does not deny the fact that an inner contradiction always appears in phenomena as an external one. The immediate coincidence of mutually exclusive economic determinations in each of the two commodities meeting in exchange is also the true theoretical expression of the essence of simple commodity exchange. And this essence is value. From the logical aspect, the concept of value is characterized by its being presented as an immediate contradiction, as the direct coincidence of two forms of economic existence that are polar opposites. Thus, what was effected in the real act of exchange was impossible from the angle of abstract reason, namely, the direct or immediate identification of opposites. This was the theoretical expression of the real fact that direct commodity exchange could not be completed smoothly. 56 Capital, Volume 1 MECW Vol 35, page 66. Problems of dialectics. 110. Without collisions, without conflicts, without contradictions and crises. The point was that direct commodity exchange was not in a position to express the socially necessary measure of the expenditure of labor in the various branches of social production, i.e. value. And value therefore remained, within the limits of the simple commodity form, an unresolved and unresolvable antinomy. In it the commodity had to be, yet could not be, in the two polar forms of expression of value, and consequently real exchange by value was impossible. But it did happen somehow, and consequently both polar forms of value were somehow combined in each commodity. There was no way out of the antinomy. Marx's contribution was precisely that he understood that, and expressed it theoretically. Insofar as exchange through the market remained the sole and universal form of the social exchange of things, the antinomy of value found its solution in the movement of the commodity market itself. The market created the means for resolving its own contradictions, so money was born. Exchange became not direct and unmediated, but mediated, through money, and the coincidence of mutually exclusive economic forms in a commodity came to an end, as it were, since it was split into two different relations. Into an act of sale and an act of purchase. The two antinomic acts, mutually exclusive in their economic content, already did not coincide immediately but were completed at a different time and in different parts of the market. The antinomy seemed at first glance to be resolved by all the rules of formal logic, but the semblance was purely external. In fact, the antinomy had not disappeared at all, but had only acquired a new form of expression. Money did not become absolutely pure value, and the commodity thus pure use value. Both commodity and money were fraught, as before, with an inner contradiction that was expressed, as before, in thought in the form of a contradiction in determinations. Once again, moreover, the contradiction was unresolved and unresolvable, and revealed itself in the clearest way. Though only from time to time, precisely in crises, and then making itself felt the more strongly. The only commodity is money, says the commodity owner at times when this contradiction does not show on the surface. The only money is commodities, he asserts in a directly opposite way during a crisis, refuting his own abstract statement. Marx is theoretical, but concrete. Thinking showed that the inner opposition of the economic determinations of money existed at every fleeting second, even when they were not manifested in an obvious, visible way but were hidden in commodities and in money. When everything was apparently going swimmingly and the contradiction seemed resolved once and for all. In theoretical determinations of money, the antinomy of value brought out earlier was preserved. In them it formed the simple essence both of commodities and of money, although on the surface of phenomena it proved to be annulled, broken down into two different relations. But these relations, like the direct exchange of commodity for commodity, formed an inner unity that was preserved in all its acuteness and tension in both commodities and money, and consequently also in theoretical determinations of the one and of the other. As before, value remained an internally contradictory relation of a commodity to itself, which was no longer revealed, though, on the surface through a direct relation to another commodity of the same sort, but through its relation to money. Money now functioned as the means by which the mutual, reciprocal transformation of the two originally exposed poles of the expression of value was effected. From that angle the whole logical structure of capital was traced out from a new and very important aspect. Any concrete category was presented as a metamorphosis through which value and use value passed during their reciprocal transformations into one another. The forming of the capitalist, commodity system appears in Marx's theoretical analysis as a complicating of the chain of connecting links through which the poles of value, mutually attracting and at the same time excluding each other, have to pass. The path of the reciprocal transformation of value and use value becomes longer and longer, and more complicated, and the tension between the poles increases. Problems of dialectics. 111. The relative and temporary resolution of the tension takes place through crises, and its final resolution is through socialist revolution. That approach to things immediately gave thought and orientation in the analysis of any form of economic relation. In fact, just as the commodity market found a relative resolution of its objective contradictions in the birth of money, so the theoretical determinations of money and capital served as a means of relatively resolving the theoretical contradiction revealed in the analysis of the simple value form. Within the limits of the simple form, the antimony of value remained unresolved and fixed in thought as a contradiction in the concept. Its sole true logical resolution consisted in tracing how it was resolved objectively in practice in the course of the movement itself of the commodity market. And the movement of the investigating thought consisted in revealing this new reality that developed by virtue of the impossibility of resolving the objective contradiction originally disclosed. Thus the very course of theoretical thought became not a confused wandering but a rigorous purposive process, in which thinking used empirical facts to find the conditions and data that were lacking for solution of a clearly formulated task, of a problem. Theory therefore appeared as a process of the constant resolution of problems pushed to the fore by the investigation of the empirical facts itself. Investigation of the commodity money circulation led to an antinomy. As Marx wrote, turn and twist as we may, the sum total remains the same. If equivalents are exchanged, then no surplus value is created, and if non-equivalents are exchanged, still no surplus value is created. Circulation, the exchange of commodities, does not create value, so, he concluded, capital could not arise from circulation, just as it could not arise outside it. It must simultaneously take place in the sphere of circulation and outside the sphere of circulation. Such are the conditions of the problem. That is the nut we have to crack. Marx's way of posing the problem was not at all fortuitous and was not simply a rhetorical device. It was linked with the very essence of the dialectical method of developing theory, following the development of the actual object. The solution of the question corresponds to the posing of it. The problem arising in thought in the form of a contradiction in the determination could only be resolved if the theoretician was lucky enough to find somewhere within the sphere of circulation, to find in the market, a commodity whose use, value has the peculiar quality of being a source of value, a commodity whose actual consumption is a process whereby labor is embodied, and whereby therefore value is created. Objective reality always develops through the origin within it of a concrete contradiction that finds its resolution in the generation of a new, higher, and more complex form of development. The contradiction is unresolvable. When expressed in thought, it naturally appears as a contradiction in the determinations of the concept that reflects the initial stage of development. And that is not only correct, but is the sole correct form of movement of the investigating mind, although there is a contradiction in it. A contradiction of that type in determinations is not resolved by way of refining the concept that reflects the given form of development, but by further investigating reality, by discovering another, new, higher form of development in which the initial contradiction finds its real, actual, empirically established resolution. It was not fortuitous that the old logic passed this very important logical form over as a question. For the real questions, the real problems that arise in the movement of the investigating mind, always rise before thought in the form of contradictions in the determination, in the theoretical expression of the facts. The concrete contradiction that arises in thought also leads toward a further and, moreover. 57 Capital, Volume 1 MECW Vol 35 page 174, 58 Capital, Volume 1, MECW Vol 35, page 177. Marx actually used the Latin tag hic rotus, hic salta, which the Pauls render here as that is the nut we have to crack, tr 59 edit, page 177. Problems of dialectics. 112. Purpose of examining of the facts, toward the finding and analyzing of just those facts that are lacking for solving the problem and resolving the given theoretical contradiction. If a contradiction arises of necessity in the theoretical expression of reality from the very course of the investigation, it is not what is called a logical contradiction, though it has the formal signs of such but is a logically correct expression of reality. On the contrary, the logical contradiction, which there must not be in a theoretical investigation, has to be recognized as a contradiction of terminological, semantic origin and properties. Formal analysis is also obliged to discover such contradictions and determinations, and the principle of contradiction of formal logic applies fully to them. Strictly speaking, it relates to the use of terms and not to the process of the movement of a concept. The latter is the field of dialectical logic. But there another law is dominant, the law of the unity or coincidence of opposites, a coincidence, moreover, that goes as far as their identity. It is that which constitutes the real core of dialectics as the logic of thought that follows the development of reality. 11. The problem of the general in dialectics. The category of the general or universal occupies an extremely important place in the body of dialectical logic. What is the general or universal? Literally, in the meaning of the word, it is relating to all, i.e. to all individuals in the form of the limitless multitude of which the world within which we live and about which we speak presents itself to us at first glance. That is, very likely, all that can be said about the general that is unquestionable, equally acceptable to everyone. Without going into the philosophical disagreements about the general or universal, one can note that the term common is used very ambiguously in the living language, indeterminately, and relates not only to different objects or meanings that do not coincide with one another, but also to directly opposite ones that are mutually exclusive. Any large dictionary contains a dozen such meanings. At the extremes of the spectrum, moreover, there are meanings such as can scarcely be considered consistent or compatible. Common is used even for two objects, let alone all, both for what appertains to each of them and cannot exist separately from the relevant individual in the form of a separate thing, and for what exists precisely outside the individual in the form of a special individuum, namely a common ancestor, a common field, i.e. one for two, a common motor vehicle or entry, a common friend or acquaintance, and so on and so forth. One and the same word, or one and the same sign, obviously does not serve just for one and the same thing. Whether one sees in that the imperfection of natural language or on the contrary considers it the superiority of the flexibility of a living language over the rigidity of the definitions of an artificial language, the fact itself remains a fact and one, moreover, that is often encountered and therefore calls for explanation. But then the quite reasonable question arises, whether or not it is possible to find something common between two extreme, mutually exclusive meanings of the word common in the living language, equally sanctioned by usage. To find the basis of the fact of the divergence of meanings. In the interpretation that is sanctioned as the sole correct one by the tradition of formal logic, it is impossible to discover such a common attribute as would form part of the definition of two polar meanings of common. Nevertheless, it is clear that here, as in many other cases, we are dealing with related words which, like human relatives, although they have nothing in common between them, all with equal right bear one and the same surname. This relationship between the terms of natural language was once brought out by Ludwig Wittgenstein as quite typical in the following example. Churchill A has a family likeness to Churchill B in attributes A, B, C. Churchill B shares attributes B, C, D with Churchill C. Churchill D has only a single attribute in common with Churchill A, while Churchill E and Churchill A have not a single one in common, nothing except the name. Problems of dialectics. 113. The image of a common ancestor, however, of a progenitor, cannot be reconstructed by abstracting those attributes, and only those that are genetically preserved by all his descendants. There simply are no such attributes. But there is a community of name, recording a common origin. It is the same with common as a term. The original meaning of the word also cannot be established by a purely formal union of attributes, uniting all the offspring terms into one family, into one class. Because Churchill Alpha would have to be represented as an individuum who was simultaneously both brunette and blonde, both gangling and dwarfish, both snub-nosed and hook-nosed, and so on. But there, of course, the analogy ends, because the position with related terms is rather different. The ancestor, as a rule, does not die but continues to live alongside all its offspring as an individuum among other individua. And the problem consists in discovering among the existing separate individua the one that was born before the others and therefore could have given birth to all the rest. Among the attributes of a common ancestor who continues to live among his descendants, one has to presuppose a capacity to give birth to something which is opposite to itself, i.e. a capacity to give birth both to the gangling and the dwarfish. The common ancestor, consequently, can be representable as an individuum of medium height with a straight nose and ash-gray locks, i.e. to combine opposing determinations in himself, to combine both the one and the other. Directly opposite determinations in himself, like a solution or mixture. Thus the color gray can be fully represented as mixture of black and white, i.e. as simultaneously white and black. There is nothing incompatible in that with the common sense that neopositivists like to enlist as an ally against dialectical logic. But it is just here that the two incompatible positions in logic, and an understanding of the general, take shape, that of dialectics and the completely formal conception. The latter has no desire to admit into logic the idea of development organically linked with the concept of substance, i.e. the principle of the genetic community of phenomena that are at first glance quite heterogeneous. It was thus that Hegel saw the point of departure of the paths of dialectical thought and purely formal thought, and in that connection he highly values Aristotle's relevant statement, as to what concerns more nearly the relation of the three souls. As they may be termed, Aristotle says of them, with perfect truth, that we need look for no one soul in which all these are found, and which in a definite and simple form is conformable with any of them. This is a profound observation, by means of which truly speculative thought marks itself out from the thought which is merely logical and formal. Similarly among figures only the triangle and the other definite figures, like the square, the parallelogram, etc., are truly anything, for what is common to them, the universal figure, is an empty thing of thought, a mere abstraction. On the other hand, the triangle is the first, the truly universal figure, which appears also in the square, etc., as the figure which can be led back to the simplest determination. Therefore, on the one hand, the triangle stands alongside of the square, pentagon, etc., as a particular figure, but, and this is Aristotle's main contention, it is the truly universal figure. Aristotle's meaning is therefore this: an empty universal is that which does not itself exist, or is not itself species. All that is universal is in fact real, in that by itself, without further change, it constitutes its first species, and when further developed it belongs, not to this, but to a higher stage. If we look at the problem of the determination of the general as a universal category from this angle, or at the problem of the theoretical reconstruction of the common ancestor of a family of related meanings seemingly having nothing in common, there is some hope of resolving it. 60 Hegel's Lectures on the History of Philosophy, Vol. 2, Aristotle pages 185-86. Problems of Dialectics. 114. The stand of formal logic, oriented on finding the abstract, common element in every single representative of one class yields nothing in this instance. The general in this sense cannot be found here, and cannot for the reason that there actually is no such thing, not in the form of attribute or determination, actually common to all the individual in the form of a resemblance proper to each of them taken separately. It is quite clear that the concrete essence of the link uniting the various individua in some one, in a common multitude or plurality, is by no means posited and expressed in an abstract attribute common to them, or in a determination that is equally proper to the one and the other. Rather such unity is created by the attribute that one individuum possesses and another does not. And the absence of a certain attribute binds one individuum to another much more strongly than its equal existence in both. Two absolutely equal individuals, each of which has the very same set of knowledge, habits, inclinations, etc. Would be absolutely uninteresting to one another, and the one would not need the other. They would simply bore each other to death. It is nothing but a simple doubling of solidariness. The general is anything but continuously repeated similarity in every single object taken separately and represented by a common attribute and fixed by a sign. The universal is above all the regular connection of two particular individuals that converts them into moments of one and the same concrete, real unity. And it is much more reasonable to represent this unity as the aggregate of different, separate moments than as an indefinite plurality of units indifferent to one another. Here the general functions as the law or principle of the connection of these details in the makeup of some whole, or totality as Marx preferred to call it, following Hegel. Here analysis rather than abstraction is called for. If we return to the question of the genetic community of the different meanings that the term common or general has acquired in the evolution of the living language, the problem seemingly boils down to recognizing that among them which can confidently be considered as the progenitor meaning, and then to tracing why and how the initial meaning, first in time and immediately simple in essence, was broadened so as to embrace something opposite. Something that was not originally intended at all, since it is difficult to suspect our remote ancestors of an inclination to invent abstract objects and constructions. It is more logical to consider the original meaning the one that the term common still preserves in such expressions as common ancestor and common field. Philological research provides evidence, incidentally, in favor of that view. What would old Hegel say in the next world, Marx wrote with satisfaction to Engels, if he heard that the general in German and Norse means nothing but the common land, and the particular, sundry, bessendier. Nothing but the separate property divided off from the common land? Here are the logical categories coming damn well out of our intercourse after all. It is quite understandable that if we have in mind here the originally simple, truly general meaning of the word, as Hegel would have said, then it is impossible to discover in the idea according to which the general precedes the individual, the separate, the particular, the isolated, or exclusive, both in essence and in time, even a hint of the refined mysticism that permeates the corresponding views of Neoplatonists and medieval Christian scholasticism, whereby the universal is made a synonym of the idea, being considered from the very beginning as the word, as logos, as something incorporeal, spiritualized, purely mental. On the contrary, the universal in its original meaning appears distinctly in the mind, and therefore in the language expressing it, as a synonym of a quite corporeal substance, in the form of water, fire, tiny uniform particles, and so on. Such a notion may be considered naive, crudely sensual, too materialistic, but there is not the slightest tendency to, or trace of, mysticism in it. 61 Marx to Engels March 25, 1868, MECW Vol 42, pages 557. Problems of dialectics. 115. It is therefore quite absurd to press the accusation that is constantly advanced against materialism by its opponents, the accusation of a disguised Platonism that is imminently linked, as it were, with the thesis of the objective reality of the universal. If, of course, one takes the view from the very beginning that the universal is the idea, and only the idea, then not only do Marx and Spinoza turn out to be cryptoplatonists but also Thales and Democritus. One is forced to evaluate the identification of the universal with the idea as an axiom accepted quite without proof, as the purest prejudice inherited from the Middle Ages. Its vitality is not fortuitous but is linked with the really immense role that the word and the verbal explication of the idea have played and play in the molding of intellectual culture. From that, too, arises the illusion that the universal allegedly has its actual existence only and exclusively in the form of logos, in the form of the meaning of a word, term, or linguistic sign. Since philosophical consciousness specially reflecting on the universal is concerned from the very beginning with its verbal expression, the dogma of the identity of the universal and the sense of a word also begins to seem a natural premise, and the soil on which it grows, and the air that it breathes, to be something self-evident. We would note in passing that the prejudice described here, read as absolute truth by modern neopositivists, also seemed such to Hegel, who is not a favorite with them. Hegel, too, candidly suggested that materialism was impossible as a philosophical system on the grounds that philosophy was the science of the universal, and the universal was the idea, just the idea, and only the idea, and could not be anything else. He had the immense advantage over the latest devotees of this prejudice that he understood thought itself much more profoundly. Thus it was Hegel himself who thoroughly undermined the prestige of the prejudice that consisted in identifying thought and speech, but he returned a prisoner to it by a roundabout route since, though he did not consider the word the sole form of the being there of an idea, it retained the significance of the first form of its being for him, both in time and in essence. Hegel, and this was typical of him in general, first smashed the old prejudice, and then restored it to all its rights by means of a cunningly clever dialectical apparatus. The radical, materialist rethinking of the achievements of his logic carried through by Marx, Engels, and Lenin, was linked with affirmation of the objective reality of the universal, not at all in the spirit of Plato or Hegel, but rather in the sense of a law-governed connection of material phenomena, in the sense of the law of their being joined together in the composition of some whole, in the context of a self-developing totality or aggregate, all the components of which were related as a matter of fact not by virtue of their possessing one and the same identical attribute, but by virtue of a unity of genesis, by virtue of their having one and the same common ancestor, or to put it more exactly, by virtue of their arising as diverse modifications of one and the same substance of a quite material character. Uniform phenomena therefore do not necessarily possess anything like a family resemblance as the sole grounds for being counted as one class. The universal in them may be outwardly expressed much better in the form of differences, even opposites, that make the separate phenomena complement one another, components of a whole, of some quite real, organic aggregate, and not an amorphous plurality of units taken together on the basis of a more or less chance attribute. On the other hand, the universal, which manifests itself precisely in the particularities, in the individual characteristics of all the components of the whole without exception, also exists in itself as alongside other isolated individua derived from it. In that there is nothing even remotely mystical, a father often lives a very long time side by side with his sons, and if he is not present, he was once, of course, i.e. In that there is nothing even remotely mystical, a father often lives a very long time side by side with his sons, and if he is not present, he was once, of course, i.e. must be definitely thought of in the category of being there. The genetically understood universal does not simply exist, naturally, in the ether of the abstract, in the elements of the word and idea, and its existence in no way abolishes or belittles the reality of its modifications and of the separate individua derived from it and dependent on it. Problems of dialectics. 116. In Marx's analysis of capital, the concept of the universal that we have briefly described plays most important methodological role. To the extent that we are considering it here, as a relation distinct from that of value and money, capital is capital in general, i.e. the incarnation of the qualities which distinguish value as capital from value as pure value or as money. Value, money, circulation, etc., prices, etc., are presupposed, as is labor, etc., but we are still concerned with neither with a particular form of capital, nor with an individual capital as distinct from other individual capitals, etc. We are present at the process of its becoming. This dialectical process of its becoming is only the ideal expression of the real movement through which capital comes into being. The later relations are to be regarded as its developments coming out of this germ, but it is necessary to establish the specific form in which it is posited at a certain point. Otherwise confusion arises. Here there is very clearly brought out that relation between value and capital which Hegel in the passage cited above, discovered between a triangle and a square, pentagon, etc., and, moreover, in a dual sense. The concept of value in general is in no case defined here through the aggregate of the abstract, general attributes that one may want to discover in the composition of all its special forms, but is achieved by way of the most rigorous analysis of one single, quite specific, and actually existing relation between people, the relation of the direct exchange of one commodity for another. In the analysis of this value reality, reduced to its simplest form, the universal determinations of value are brought out that are later met at higher levels of development and analysis as abstract, general determinations of money and labor power, and capital. If we are concerned with defining capital in general, then, as Marx specially remarked, we must take the following point of principle into account, which has more of a logical than an economic character. Capital in general, as distinct from the particular real capitals, is itself a real existence. This is recognized by ordinary economics, even if it is not understood, and forms a very important moment of its doctrine of equilibrations, etc. For example, capital in this general form, although belonging to individual capitalists, in its elemental form as capital, forms the capital which accumulates in the banks or is distributed through them, and, as Ricardo says, so admirably distributes itself in accordance with the needs of production. Likewise, through loans, etc., it forms a level between the different countries. If it is therefore e.g., a law of capital in general that, in order to realize itself, it must posit itself doubly, and must realize itself in this double form, then e.g., the capital of a particular nation which represents capital par excellence in antithesis to another will have to lend itself out to a third nation in order to be able to realize itself. This double positing, this relating to self as to an alien, becomes damn real in this case. While the general is therefore on the one hand only a mental mark of distinction, it is at the same time a particular real form alongside the form of the particular and individual. It is the same also in algebra, Marx continued. For example, a, b, c, are numbers as such, in general, but then again they are whole numbers as opposed to a b, bc, cb, ca, ba, etc. Which latter, however, presuppose the former as their general elements, the situation of the dialectical relation between the general and the particular, the individual. By virtue of which the general cannot in principle be revealed in the makeup of the particular individuals by formal abstraction can be most vividly demonstrated by the example of the theoretical difficulties connected with the concept man. 62 Grundriss, MECW Vol 28, page 236, 63 Ibid, page 377-78, 64 De Ricardo, On the Principles of Political Economy, London 1821, page 139, 65 Marx, Grundriss, page 378. There is a footnote in the Grundriss at this point, cf. Hegel, Science of Logic, page 600. TRAV Miller, London 1969, 66 Grundriss, MECW Vol 28, page 379. Problems of Dialectics. 117. With the definition of the essence of man, the solution of which was found by Marx, basing himself precisely on a dialectical understanding of the problem of the general. The essence of man is no abstraction inherent in each separate individual. In its reality it is the ensemble of social relations, as Marx aphoristically formulated his conception in the famous Theses on Feuerbach. Here one clearly sees not only the sociological principle of Marx's thinking, but also its logical principle. Translated into the language of logic, his aphorism means that it is useless to seek the general determinations expressing the essence of a class, be it the human race or some other genus, in a series of the abstract general attributes possessed by each member of the given class taken separately. The essence of human nature in general can only be brought out through a scientific, critical analysis of the whole ensemble of man's social and historical relations to man. Through concrete investigation and understanding of the patterns with which the process of the birth and evolution both of human society as a whole and of the separate individual has taken place and is taking place. The separate individual is only human in the exact and strict sense of the word, insofar as he actualizes, and just by his individuality, some ensemble or other of historically developed faculties of a culture formed before and independently of him, and mastered by him during upbringing. From that angle the human personality can rightly be considered as an individual embodiment of culture, i.e. of the universal in man. Universality so understood is by no means a silent, generic sameness of individuals but reality repeatedly and diversely broken up within itself into particular spheres mutually complementing each other and in essence mutually dependent on each other and therefore linked together by bonds of community of origin no less firm and no less flexible than the organs of the body of a biological specimen developed from one and the same egg cell. In other words, theoretical, logical determination of the concrete universality of human life can consist solely in disclosing the necessity with which the diverse forms of specifically human life activity develop one from the other and an interaction of the one on the other. The faculties of social man and his corresponding needs. The materialist conception of the essence of man sees the universal form of human life in labor, in the direct transformation of nature that social man brings about with the help of tools made by himself. That is why Marx felt such sympathy to Benjamin Franklin's famous definition of man as a tool-making animal and only therefore also a thinking animal, talking, composing music, obeying moral norms, and so on. The definition of man in general as a tool-making animal is a typical example in which the Marxian conception of the universal as the concretely universal is seen most clearly of all, and also the Marxian conception of its relation to the particular and the individual. From the standpoint of the canons of formal logic this definition is much too concrete to be universal, for under it such undoubted members of the human race as Mozart or Leo Tolstoy, Raphael or Kant cannot be subsumed. Formally, such a definition applies only to a narrow circle of individuals, to the workers in engineering works, say, or workshops. Even workers who do not make machines but only use them, formally do not come within the scope of this definition. The old logic therefore rightly regarded it not as a universal but exclusively as a particular definition, not as a definition of man in general but of a particular profession. The general stands opposed to the sensuously given variety of separate individuals primarily not as a mental abstraction but as their own substance, as a concrete form of their interaction. As such, it also embodies or includes the whole wealth of the particular and individual in its concrete determinateness, and that not simply as the possibility of development but as its necessity. The 67 See Ilyenkov's Dialectics of the Abstract and Concrete in Marx's Capital, 1960, 68 Marx, Theses on Feuerbach, MECW Vol 5, page 4. Problems of Dialectics. 118. Conception of the general and of its paths of scientific realization described here is by no means the monopoly of philosophical dialectics. Science, in its real historical development, unlike its depiction in the epistemological and logical constructions of neopositivists, always begins, more or less consistently, from such a concept of the universal. And that often in spite of the conscious logical precepts and maxims that its representatives profess. This circumstance is clearly traceable in the history of the concept value, a universal category of political economy. The abstraction of value in general and the word that records it are as old as market relations. The Greek aksha, the German worth, and so on were not created by Sir William Petty, or Adam Smith, or Ricardo. Every merchant and peasant of all ages used value or worth for everything that could be bought or sold, everything that cost something, or was worth something. And if the theoretical political economists had tried to work out a concept of value in general, guided by the recipes that purely formal, nominalistically oriented logic still suggests to science, they would never, of course, have done so. Here it has not been a matter at all, from the very beginning, of the bringing out of the abstractly general, of the similar that each of the objects possesses. Which general word usage long ago united in the term value. The whole point, however, is that the classical political economists posed the question quite differently, so that the answer to it proved to be a concept, i.e. an awareness of the real generality. Marx pointed out clearly the essence of their posing of the question. The first English economist Sir William Petty arrived at the concept of value by the following reasoning: if a man can bring to London an ounce of silver out of the earth in Peru in the same time that he can produce a bushel of corn, then one is the natural price of the other. Let us note in passing that in the reasoning adduced here the term value is absent in general, natural price being spoken of. But we are present here right at the birth of the fundamental concept of all subsequent science of the production, distribution, and accumulation of wealth. Here the concept also expresses such a real phenomenon given an experience as at the same time proves to be universal and represents value in general. The classical political economists spontaneously groped out the way of determining value in its general form, but in retrospect, having already formed the relevant concept, they tried to verify it in accordance with the canons of logic. Relying on Locke's notions about thought and the universal, which led them into a number of paradoxes and antinomies. The general, when they tried to justify it by analysis of its own particular variants, like profit and capital, was not only not confirmed, but was directly refuted by them, contradicted by them. Only Marx succeeded in establishing the reason for the origin of the various paradoxes, and so the way out, and he did so just because he was guided by dialectical notions of the nature of the general and its relations with the particular and the individual. The reality of the universal in nature is a law, but a law in its reality is not realized as some abstract rule by which the movement of each single particle taken separately would be governed, but only as a tendency manifesting itself in the behavior of a more or less complex ensemble of individual phenomena, through the breach and negation of the universal in each of its separate manifestations. And thought is forced willy-nilly to take that circumstance into account. 69 Sir W. M. Petty, A Treatise of Taxes and Contributions, 1867, cited by Marx in Theories of Surplus Value, Part 1, page 356. Problems of Dialectics. 119. The general determinations of value are worked out in capital in the course of an analysis of one example of the concreteness of value, historically the first and therefore logically the simplest, i.e., the direct exchange or barter of one commodity for another. With the most rigorous abstraction of all other individual forms, namely money, profit, land rent, and so on. Marx saw the shortcoming of Ricardo's analysis of value precisely in his not being able, when examining the problem of value in its general form, to forget profit. That is why Ricardo's abstraction proved incomplete and so formal. Marx himself obtained a solution of the problem in general form because all the subsequent formations, not only profit but also even money, were taken as not existent at the start of the analysis. Only direct exchange or barter without money was analyzed, and it was immediately clear that such a raising of its individual to the general differed in principle from the act of simple, formal abstraction. Here the peculiarities of the simple commodity form, specifically distinguishing it from profit, land rent, interest, and other individual forms of value, were not thrown away as something inessential, quite the contrary. Their theoretical expression coincided with the determination of value in its general form. The incompleteness of Ricardo's abstraction, and the formality linked with it, consisted precisely in its being formed on the one hand through his inability to abstract it from the existence of other developed forms of value, and on the other hand through his abstracting of the peculiarities of direct commodity exchange. The general was thus taken in the end as completely isolated from the particular and separate, and ceased to be its theoretical expression. That is what distinguishes the dialectical conception of the general from the purely formal conception. The distinction between Marx's dialectical materialist conception, however, and the interpretation given the general in Hegel's idealistic dialectics is no less important. And it is important to bring this out clearly for the reason that their conceptions are too often equated in Western literature. Yet it is quite obvious that the orthodox Hegelian interpretation of the general, despite all its dialectical value, comes close, on a decisive point of principle and not just in details, to that very metaphysical view that Hegel himself had so strongly undermined the authority and influence of. This comes out particularly clearly in the concrete applications of the principles of Hegelian logic to the analysis of real, earthly problems. The point is as follows. When Hegel explains his speculative conception of the general in opposition to the purely formal on the example of geometrical figures, it may seem at first glance that here was the logical schema in ready-made form that enabled Marx to cope with the problem of the general determination of value. Actually, it would seem that Hegel saw the difference between genuine universality and purely formal abstraction in the truly generals itself existing in the form of the particular, i.e., it's an empirically given reality existing in time and space and perceived in contemplation. According to Hegel, the general as such, in its strict and exact sense, exists exclusively in the ether of pure thought and in no case in the space and time of external reality. In that sphere we are dealing only with a number of particular alienations, embodiments, hypostases of the genuinely general. That was why the definition of man as a tool-making animal would have been quite unacceptable to Hegelian logic, and logically incorrect. For the orthodox Hegelian, as for any representative of the formal logic criticized by him, Franklin's definition was much too concrete to be general or universal. In the production of tools, Hegel saw not the basis of everything human in man, but only one, though important, manifestation of his thinking nature. In other words, the idealism of the Hegelian interpretation of the general leads to the very same result as the metaphysical interpretation he so disliked. When Hegelian logic is taken in its pristine form as the means of evaluating the movement of thought in the first chapters of Capital, the whole movement seems illegitimate and illogical. The Hegelian logician would be right, from his angle, if he were to say of Marx's analysis of value that there problems of dialectics 120 was no general determination of this category in it, that Marx only described but did not theoretically deduce the determination of one special, particular form of the realization of value in general, because that, like any truly general category of human life activity, was a form immanent in the rational will and not in man's external being, in which it was only manifested and materialized. So Hegelian logic, despite all its superiority over formal logic, could not and cannot be taken into the armory of materialistically oriented science without any essential amendments, and without a radical purging of all traces of idealism. For idealism did not remain something external for logic at all, but orientated the very logical sequence of thought. When Hegel spoke, for example, of the transitions of opposing categories, the schema of the examination then and there received a one-way character. In the Hegelian schema there could be no place, say, for the transition that Marx discovered in the determinations of value, the transformation of the singular or individual into the general. With Hegel only the general had the privilege of alienating itself in forms of the particular and the singular, while the singular always proved to be a product, a particular modus of universality. The actual history of economic relations testified, however, in Marx's favor, demonstrating that the form of value in general was by no means always the general form of the organization of production. It became the general, but up to a certain point it remained a particular relation happening from time to time between people and things in production. Only capitalism made value the general form of the interrelations of the components of production. This transition of the individual and chance into the general was not at all rare in history, but was even rather the rule. It has always happened in history that phenomena that subsequently became general arose first precisely as individual exceptions to the rule, as anomalies, as something particular and partial. Hardly anything really new can arise in any other way. It is in the light of that the rethinking to which the Hegelian dialectical conception of the general was subjected by Marx and Lenin must be understood. While preserving all the dialectical moments noted by Hegel, materialism deepened and broadened its conception, transforming the category of the general or universal into the most important category of the logic of concrete investigation of concrete, historically developing phenomena. In the context of the materialist conception of the dialectics of history and the dialectics of thought, the Hegelian formulae sound differently from on the lips of their creator, having lost all mystical coloring. The general includes and embodies in itself the whole wealth of details, not as the idea but as a quite real, particular phenomenon with a tendency to become general, and developing from itself other just as real phenomena. Other particular forms of actual movement, and there is not a trace of any of the Platonic Hegelian mystique in that. Conclusion. Quite understandably we have not undertaken the task here of giving a systematic exposition of Marxist-Leninist logic. That is beyond the power of a single person, and can scarcely be done within the space of one book. We have simply tried to throw some light on a number of the conditions and premises for further work in that direction, which we consider should be a collective effort. We think, however, that only by taking the conditions formulated above into account can such a work be successful, i.e. lead to the creation of a capital work which could rightly bear one of three titles: logic, dialectics, or the theory of knowledge, and which could take as its epigraph Lenin's words, "Three words are not needed, it is one and the same thing." The creation of a logic understood as a system of categories, of course, constitutes only one stage. The next step would have to be the realization, actualization of the logical system in a concrete scientific investigation, because the end product of all work in the field of philosophical dialectics is the resolute problems of dialectics. 121. Scion of the concrete problems of concrete sciences. Philosophy alone cannot achieve this end product, that calls for an alliance of dialectics and concrete scientific research, understood and realized as the business-like collaboration of philosophers and natural scientists, of philosophy and social and historical fields of knowledge. But in order for dialectics to be an equal collaborator in concrete scientific knowledge, it must first develop the system of its own specific philosophical concepts. From the angle of which it could display the strength of critical distinction in relation to actually given thought and consciously practiced methods. It seems to us that this conclusion stems directly from the analysis we have presented here, and that this conception corresponds directly to Lenin's ideas both on the plane of the inter-relations of the latter and the other branches of scientific knowledge. It appears to us that, in the conception set out above, logic does become an equal collaborator with the other sciences, and not their servant, and not their supreme overseer, not a science of sciences crowning their system as just another variety of absolute truth. Understood as logic, philosophical dialectics becomes a necessary component of the scientific, materialist world outlook, and no longer claims a monopoly in relation to the world as a whole. The scientific world outlook can only be described by the whole system of modern sciences. That system also includes philosophical dialectics, and without it cannot claim either fullness or scientism. The scientific world outlook that does not include philosophy, logic, and the theory of knowledge is as much nonsense as the pure philosophy that assumes that it alone is the world outlook, taking on its shoulders a job that can only be done by a whole complex of sciences. Philosophy is also the logic of the development of the world outlook, or, as Lenin put it, its living soul.